You share that too.
Yeah. All right, welcome to the first quarter audit committee meeting. We'll do a call to order and roll call, please.
Chairperson Ferguson,
Present?
Vice Chairperson Bertrand,
Here.
Member Bagwell,
Here.
Member Mayhorn,
Here.
Member Strasburg.
Here.
Quorum is present.
Okay, thank you. Comments from the public, I'll read this anyway. The public is invited at this time to comment on and discuss any topic that is relevant or within the authority of the Carson City Audit Committee. In order for members of the public to participate in the committee's consideration for an agenda item, the committee strongly encourages members of the public to comment on an agenda item during the item itself. No action may be taken on a matter raised under public comment unless the item has been specifically included on the agenda as an item upon which action may be taken. Okay, next item is approval of the October 23rd minutes. Any motion for that?
I move to approve the minutes as presented.
I'll second that.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Passes. Adoption of today's agenda. Any changes or amendments to the agenda for today? Okay, great. And on to the meeting item, 6A, possible action, discussion on possible action regarding the monitoring review and closure of internal audit findings or recommendations included in the audit findings tracking report, and provide recommendation to the Board of Supervisors to close completed findings and or recommendations. Good
Thank
afternoon,
you.
Sherry.
Good afternoon, thank you. So first, I want to apologize for the few grammatical errors that were in here, probably more than a few. It's Excel. I have gone through and run spell check on every single cell and sheet, so it should be better going forward. And I'll do that before I send it out to you guys in the future. So for the first one, capital projects process review, Public Works has made some great strides. I saw Dan Stuckey come in if you have any specific questions. And I don't know if you want me to go through every single item one at a time, but we're looking at potentially closing item number 4 on this audit. And most of them are going to be addressed with a public project manual that they're creating that should be done by June of 2019.
We'll have to raise our hands, we
Yep.
have buttons too. I'm like, where's my button? So I just have a question in general, and it's probably for all the departments. It might be for Eric, it might be for you, but I notice across many systems in the city, we are waiting for ERP implementation, which I think is the right thing to do. You certainly wouldn't spend money if you're getting a new computer system, but I'm a little bit worried that we make sure that everything we're waiting for in the ERP system is sitting in one listing to make sure it's addressed in the ERP system. If that makes sense, what I'm saying is I'm concerned we'll implement and they go, oh, we still have this problem, we still have this problem. So
Yeah.
do we have some mechanism that we're capturing the?
Well, the way I've been addressing that, because there's certain modules of the ERP system that are being implemented at different times, so I'm making sure that a key person within that implementation team is aware of what they need to make sure the system has. And if it doesn't, then we need to look at another solution. But we're definitely making sure that somehow we can address it with that team, who's that implementation team. Because for instance, for this one, the contracts, I'm not part of that team. So we're letting that team know that, hey, we really want to go electronic. We had Carol in on
Can you
a
add that in
meeting.
the spreadsheet?
Sure.
And who the contact is on the team? Because
Sure.
again, we have great staff. I don't want anyone to think anything different, but I'd like to see this then assigned to and put a person's name that knows their, to the contract team,
Yeah, that's
manager,
no
so
problem.
on, whatever, wherever you're assigning it, just so that we're just not letting something drop through a
Right,
gap
and
by
we've run
accident.
into several things like this, and I'm like, okay, we need to make sure that person knows.
Right.
So,
So
yeah.
I think just adding a name will make sure
Sure.
it was transferred over. I'd appreciate that.
No, that makes perfect sense. We'll go ahead.
Yeah, and another thing to check too is just before we add solution recommendation, comment on it, that the ERP is gonna address it, that we go back and make sure that was on the requirements document that we used when we selected the ERP, so
Yeah.
we make sure that it's captured somewhere.
Right. Okay, sure.
I did have a comment on number 6. The last column got chopped off in my printout at my home, but the staff comments says this item will be addressed in July 2020. Is that a typo?
It is, it should be July 19, 2019.
For the FY 20 implementation.
Yes.
Yeah. Because we're still on track for that, for, July 1st, kind of go live? Or?
Yeah, that's the financial. This is actually the manual that they're creating, so that'll probably be in Word. So they just need time to work with all their departments to get all the little nuts and bolts of that process together.
Okay.
So that should be, yeah.
Mr. Chairman? And maybe Dan will have to address, because it's Public Works, because I noticed originally on number 2, the status indicated throughout that there was no plan to do a manual. You thought the checklist was gonna be the easier work process. Tell me what changed your mind to go back, because that is what the original auditor said, you really need a manual.
Yeah.
So what changed for you to say manual?
Yeah, that's a great question. Dan Stuckey, city engineer for the record. Really what changed is right now we have a lot of procedures or guidelines or policies, whatever you want to call them, for each various steps of the project process from start of the project to finish. And a checklist would have kind of brought those together in one place, but they'd still be, it's not in one manual. And when we started to look at like best practices and what we referenced the Project Management Institute, so that's PMI, that's industry standard to how to manage projects. We started feeling like really to get in line with what we should do and what's the proper way to do from an industry standpoint, it really makes a lot of sense to bring everything together in a project manual that's available to all of our project managers and follow kind of the process that the PMI, the Project Management Institute, recommends. So that was really the change as we got into it. It just made a lot of sense to do it right, and that's the right way to do it.
And you think you'll be able to have this done by July so that all projects for fiscal 20 will all be on the new process?
Yeah. So we're about a third of the way done right now. We have a working group that meets about every month. I'm taking the lead on drafting the manual, but every month we check in. So I think as far as the progress we've made to date, July I think is a reasonable timeline to get it done. And like I said, a lot of these things we already have created and are following. It's just bringing it together in one place, essentially.
Great. I think it's a really good move to have a manual, because then it'll let you put it on a glide path to have an annual review, or at least every 2 years, say, has any practice changed? Has any practice changed? Is there a new best practice? Great, thank you. I think that's a good change in methodology.
Good.
Dan, how prevalent is project management certification in your department, as far as, like, how many folks have that?
We have we have about 8 different people that manage projects through various, whether it be more like engineering projects or like asset management, real property. We have different project managers. We have 2 of the 8 that have the PMP certification, I guess, as far as managing projects. But it's something that we're very open to looking forward to maybe getting more people certified.
Okay, great. Good deal. Another question on number 3, the electronic signature recommendation. Is that also for the ERP? You guys talk about that the ERP is going to take care of this with electronic signatures, but is there also a workflow
Yes.
built into that so that you can tag, you know, these 5 people need to sign off on it.
Yeah,
Okay.
and ERP is very big on workflow. There's all kinds of workflows in there.
Okay, great.
Yeah, and we actually had a meeting to discuss the potential of doing electronic signatures before the ERP system. But I personally don't really like the idea of a PDF signature because it can be copied anywhere. So it's not a secure signature. So we kind of decided that it was probably best to just wait for the ERP system. So we'd have a secure timestamped signature on the documents.
Okay. Any other questions on if we got 8 findings for capital projects? Anybody else? So are any of these getting teed up for closure right now?
I was looking at hopefully closing number 4.
So procedurally, do we want to close it for this, but still not send it to the board till we're ready to send capital projects, or enough of capital you know, what procedurally do we want to do? We could close it for staff purpose, but how do we want to handle it? Do you want to wait till we have at least half of them to send to the board, process-wise? I hate to send one item to the board of supervisors for closure.
All right, not just assuming it's less confusing.
But we're okay, but we
Yeah, we can
concur
close it
with
for
4.
staff.
Okay.
Right.
I'll leave it green.
Yeah, that's it. We concur with it.
Okay.
I just hate to send one.
Okay. So we'll move on with the public guardian. And she's been quite busy. So she's addressed 3 of the items. I was actually going to recommend that we close all 4, just because she has a process of scanning paperless going forward. And the cost benefit of purchasing a $3,000 fireproof safe, we decided was probably not a good way to spend on money for 3 years of scanning. So, for 3 or 4 years of scanning. So, and then the fireproof safe would be useless. So,
Right.
so if you want to close that one too, I didn't make it green because Jean wanted to leave it open, and I was hoping she'd be here, but she's not. So.
I'm okay with closing.
Well, we talked a little bit about
Nothing about that.
So
I don't think
that
so.
one we'd be recommending that it's not a necessary implementation.
Right.
And then the board of supervisors could accept our recommendation and deem that one closed without implementation.
So all
Will be
doc-
partially implemented, because
Because of
we
the other
are
part of it,
scanning,
but
we are
not-
scanning everything,
yeah,
whereas
just
before I think
not
it was
the-
in a storage area, so.
Not the storage, but
Right.
$1,000 cabinets, right?
And the scans are all backed up?
Yes,
Like,
yes,
okay, redundant backups?
yeah.
Okay.
Eric's nodding.
Yes.
For the record, Eric's nodding.
Oh, there was, are we saying there was more? Because the recommendation was actually the fireproof file cabinet.
For I think it was for the legacy documents, right?
Right,
Yeah.
it was the, fireproof, because, it was just downstairs in a normal filing cabinet, and they didn't think that was secure. So,
those
so
are-
they've started scanning them so that they won't burn up should the city have a fire.
So what we're saying is we just took a different methodology by scanning them instead of the
Right.
storage. So
Right.
it's clear that
Right.
the actual recommendation was to,
By the
To buy.
fireproof safe, right, and
Right.
we decided that was not cost effective, but we have another solution.
right, just a different recommendation that's
Right.
more effective.
Right.
So the status should say that.
Mhm.
I'll update it, I'll update it.
Right, and then close it, that we deemed it was more appropriate to scan the documents, right? I'm like, wait a minute, this sounds not even right to me.
So you're gonna update it and we're closing the item?
I'm okay with that.
Okay.
And then that finishes the public guardian, and we could send the public guardian for final to the board, that we cleared it, closing this audit, because we're gonna pick this one up again as a re-audit later. Okay.
The fiscal year 17, this one finding that's hanging out there, I quite honestly couldn't fit the explanation in the box. So the original finding on this was that we were drawing from an approved list of vendors, and it was grant funded, so we really needed to go and get a bunch of quotes for that to be in compliance with grant funding. But we drew from a list of vendors because it was a smaller amount. But the grants, anything over 3,500, you have to get quotes. Whereas the city rules are a little different. I think it's 25,000 and we require several quotes. So, so we have kind of a conundrum between NRS and the uniform guidance for grants. So NRS says we can't just go get quotes for small amounts on architect surveys. We actually have to do a SOQ. So we have to look at their qualifications first and then negotiate a price. So the SOQ process is just like the RFP process. It's
Sorry,
long,
over what dollar amount?
over $3,500.
Federally, it's
3,500?
3,500. And actually, the architect and survey doesn't have a limit. Every single thing on NRS has to go through this SOQ process. So we have implemented a procedure that for grants drops it down to 3,500. We're going to have to do an SOQ on anything over 3,500. For the city, we're sticking with our own policies. Now, of course, uniform guidance has another rule that says we can't do that. But for everything else we do for grants, we do actually follow city policies, or the exact same thing with grants. This one, we've decided not to follow because it's not cost effective. I mean, it probably takes $5,000 to create SOQ, look at it, review it with all the people's time and effort involved. And if we're hiring somebody for $5,000, how much are they going to want to put that effort into a $5,000 SOQ? I mean, it's not cost effective. It doesn't really make sense. I did reach out to all the other counties because I had heard several other counties had the same finding, or entities, and they all said that they did not have this finding, and they were interested in what we were going to do because it was a problem. It was an issue between the two, and all of them said that they were not going to change their procedures and go down to 3,500. That was crazy. It just would be a lot of extra cost for the city unnecessarily. So, so on this one, I was hoping you guys would allow the policy of the grants dropping down to the SOQ of 35, anything over 3,500, we go get an SOQ if it's grant funded, and then the city would stick with their own policies.
So this one,
and then close
this
that
one
finding.
we might need Dan a little bit more for this, because it seems to me that the federal government is giving you a guideline and rules to comply to receive their grant, and you're signing off on paperwork that says, yes, I'll comply, yes, I'll comply, yes, 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 we will. And so I don't have an issue with saying, but like you said, one of the rules says that that's the way you do all your purchasing. I mean, there's a little standard rule in there, so, and I know the sad part is the state gets to go to the state policy, and the federal government allows the state, but they don't allow local governments, is my understanding. We don't get our own set of adopted. The state's allowed to adopt, and we're not under that. Is that a correct understanding, that the lovely state gets an exemption and we don't?
That's a good question. I don't know that I can answer that off the top of my head.
But I'm really looking, I want to lead us down the correct answer for compliance, and so I don't want to jump without a compliance answer to say, and sometimes, I don't know, can't you write to Region 9 even and say, hey, here's this and here's this, are the local governments considered under the state policy because they're really a subdivision of the state, and therefore they can use the state purchasing policy
Yes,
and
but
be
I
exempt
think,
from that condition?
yes, but I think the way that the grant rules, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think the way the grant rules read is we have to use the most conservative of the two.
The state doesn't know either.
So uniform guidance would be the most conservative.
And it's probably, the 3,500 bucks is probably a threshold they set, like 1970.
Yes, and
That's
to their
actually-
credit.
That's actually brand new.
Actually,
There's
it went up to
years.
3,500, yeah, it used to be worse.
Yeah, but a couple of agencies, it looks like they're discussing the idea of moving that to 10,000. But it's not in the law yet. The law still says 3,500. So, and we also talked to Darren Schultz about potentially, going in 2 years to the legislature and putting a bottom threshold on the NRS law. So
can
we're
come
all
into
in
compliance.
compliance with everything,
Mhm.
so that we can get quotes for under like 25,000 or something. So
So,
that.
so I guess we defer to legal for making sure that we are in compliance. I mean, obviously with the federal grants, if it's federal grant money, we have to follow all the rules. 3,500 is it, right? So the question is, can we deviate from that for
Or
other?
Vietnam,
Yeah.
right, and still be in compliance.
Right.
I guess I would, sorry, for the record, Dan Carter, and just my 2 cents, not part of what we're here to talk about today. But I think the risk is that if you have an expenditure that subsequently, that's above that $3,500 amount, that subsequently gets submitted to the feds, but it wasn't, upfront. Maybe it was, it could be a disallowed cost. Or I think the other risk is that if you have matching funds, the city's own funds that are being applied to that grant, and they didn't follow those same policies, again, they end up with the feds.
Can we get an exception for the couple of years period before the NRS has changed or something like that?
Well, I don't know. That would be calling and talking to the people who write the uniform guidance, and they basically said, well, we're looking at 10,000, but we haven't got there yet.
They're looking to change the threshold.
They are.
Because it is burdensome.
Well, yeah.
I guess I just wonder, what are the other governments doing? Just complying with the federal side at the federal and the state side on the
Yeah.
state, ignoring the uniform guidance?
Yep.
I mean, not ignoring it, but making sure that those federal expenditures are in compliance with that $3,500 limit. And if they're confident it's not going to be federal, then.
Right.
And then one of the other things I think we discussed, and I'd like to see added in here, is that you were gonna move it into the citywide purchasing manual so that people were reminded to validate whether there was federal dollars, not just the grant manual. So I'd like to see that added into this.
We did. I'm sorry, it's just not written here.
Yeah, I just like to see it added so that it's clear that we at least took the next step to put it in the overall purchasing manual.
Okay.
That'd give me a little more comfort than knowing it's only in the grant, because
Right.
it didn't help us last time when we had the
Right.
problem.
Our current auditors also cleared this as a finding, the Piercy Bowler, so I was kind of asked to close this because there's not a lot we can do until the legislature changes its rules or uniform guidance changes its rules. Unless you want us to drop down to 3,500 on everything, which I don't know if we'll even get SOQs if we're asking for that low of a dollar amount.
How many of those are there really? Because isn't it really just it's really just this particular class that the state of Nevada has
Right. It's
determined or
professional
SOQ
services, so
instead
it's
of
architects, it's
bid.
Surveyors.
Right, land,
Yeah,
there's
it's
a couple.
land, yeah.
It's kind of a
Yeah,
kind of a tough issue.
that's why this was way too long to write in the status comments, I'm
Yeah,
sorry.
kind of a tough issue.
Nancy Paulson, City Manager. Wasn't part of the problem is that for those specific, for architects and engineers, is that NRS doesn't allow you to go by a cost.
Right.
It's just based on qualifications, right?
And then
so,
you negotiate the cost later.
So
yeah.
that's why, NRS says that you can't do it that way, but the federal guidelines are saying that you need to do it that, based on cost. So I think that was part of the problem too.
Yeah,
So
that's what I said.
we maybe could have the DA's office look into that also.
Because
And maybe-
doesn't federal law, or again, is it that you say, I thought federal law wins the day, but
Yeah.
again,
I
on
don't
federal
know.
dollars, you'll comply with that, and if it's pure state dollars, you'll comply with the state.
Yeah,
IRS.
just on this one provision. I mean, it's just on this one professional services.
With architects,
Piece.
engineers, and.
Yes.
Yeah.
The rest of
There's like
it,
4
we're
or
all
5
doing
on the
exactly the
list.
same.
Mhm.
So
The
maybe
rest
we
of it,
can-
yeah, because this is the only one that has a conflicting NRS. Everything else, you know, we can drop 3,500 and get quotes, and it's not a big deal, but this one is been a challenge.
Mhm. Well, it has to be a challenge for everyone else too.
Right.
Well, nobody else apparently was aware of it. 'Cause everybody I talked to was like, what? Oh, well, let us know what you find out.
Thanks for the help.
I know, I know.
Yeah.
From a grants perspective, this item's closed, right?
Well,
Until we hear from the NRS or the feds, yeah,
So the
there's not a lot I can do.
Right, I mean, I think this item's closed. I think the question is, going back to legal compliance and saying, do we have to do this for all? Or can we just do it for the federal grant?
And yeah, and that's certainly something we can do for you.
that'd be great. I mean, it's just oh boy. It's a big issue. And again, and it may be unique to only a few states, because not every state
Right.
exempts certain classes from bidding.
Right. Well, and that's why actually Darren recommended going to those, the professional groups that are surveyors and architects and,
I know.
and actually saying you should put a limit in there because we are required, you know, by these uniform guidance to ask for an SOQ every single time we come to you because they're not gonna wanna spend the time putting together an SOQ
To answer.
to answer a
Mhm.
$5,000 job. I mean, it's just,
Mhm.
it's too small. So I think he said he was gonna talk to the groups and see about trying to fix that. It's too late but in
Mhm.
2 years, yeah.
Can we have a list of qualified, whatever, architects, engineers, surveyors, whatever the core is, and then we can say that the SAP was done, because we're doing it from a, approved list?
That's where we got in trouble in the first place.
No, that's the error.
That was
Because
the
what's
original error.
What's happening, Betsy, is Public Works would go out every couple of years and say, okay, let's create a list of architects and engineers, and every time I have a project, I turn around and look at the approved vendor list and say, yeah, Loomis is the greatest. We'll pick Loomis to work on, and no bid was done.
Oh,
It's no bid, it's just Loomis, you're
Okay.
qualified, you have a job, and we just call them up and do them, and so then the feds are disallowing the dollars because we didn't bid it to make sure it's the best price of the use of the federal dollar.
but we can't use that list and then ask them to bid?
No. Nope, the state law is
It's based on
who's the best
qualification.
qualified vendor,
And then
and then if you don't
negotiate.
like his price, you can go to the next one and refuse him, but it's not the way it works, but I'm okay with, we didn't get a repeat finding, you've added it into the purchasing manual now, not just the grant manual,
Right.
to indicate if it's federal, you will comply with the federal ruling, and then we'll have to wait for the DA's office or someone to tell us if there's a hierarchy between the state law and that federal.
Right.
And so for us, I think.
Okay, we can close this.
Unless anybody else. sees
I don't know
different.
if I'm gonna go as in-depth an explanation with the board.
But I think it's important that
Yeah,
we take it serious and we want to comply. And
right.
But like you
No,
said,
we
it's not our
do.
objective to spend $5,000 for a $3,500 job.
Exactly.
That doesn't make any sense either. Okay.
Okay, so the last one, fiscal year 18 findings. And this is, I need your direction here because I'm not sure if I should close these because the auditor hasn't closed them. So, so I've addressed the second two, the ones in blue. And the top one, we will address, but we won't know who's doing the implementation of the new standards until next year rolls around. So I left that one red. But number 2 and 3, we've implemented procedures. I'm very involved in all the board meetings, so I'll know if a contract comes through. And the departments are informing me of any contracts that come through. So I feel like that one we've addressed, but the auditor hasn't seen it and closed that finding yet. So I left it on here as blue.
Would the workflow capabilities of the new ERP take care of that issue, so you don't have to,
Probably not.
no?
No, because the annual auditors only come out once a year, so
No, I meant
Oh.
being notified of the contracts. So there should. if
Well,
you're-
I do sign all the contracts. But the issue with this one was it was a revenue contract. So only the department and the city manager were aware.
Okay.
So, but the city manager having a finance background she would tell me what's going on nowadays. So I think really I don't see this happening again
And
with
then
the current leadership.
The third one,
Mhm.
I look at that as more of like making sure you have the right internal control structure in place. It's not just a
Yeah.
procedure, right? You gotta have the internal control structure in place to make sure that stuff doesn't fall through the cracks when we have changes in.
Yeah, so
in
this has been
finance.
added to the policy to make sure that purchasing prints out the suspension and debarment when she checks it, so they can see that before we issued that contract, it was checked. And so she's keeping a PDF copy in the file with the contract. And then, as far as I understand, Public Works is also keeping a copy when they request the contract. So you should have that one covered as well going forward. And it's in the policy, so it shouldn't fall through the cracks again.
I have a question on the first one. I'm wondering specifically, what was the issue that occurred here? Was it non-reoccurring journal entries were not being reviewed?
They were being reviewed. They said that really one of my staff should have been doing it and I should have been reviewing it, and then it would have been caught, the implementation error.
Okay, so the wrong person was reviewing it, the wrong person was assigned to that.
Well, I did it and
The
I didn't
same
catch
person.
it, so.
The
Oh,
same
person that did
person.
it.
I did it and I
reviewed
didn't
it.
catch it.
Well, that's
And-
not,
and
yeah,
the-
no review, yeah.
Well, no, there was a review. I had the deputy review it, but she's not used to implementing GASB's. So she missed it too. So he felt that it would have been caught had she done it and then I reviewed it, which maybe, I can't say if I would have caught. It was one paragraph in a 70-page document that I missed, so.
So typically on these, what we do is we wait until the auditor does it on subsequent and says, no repeat, no repeat, no
Right,
repeat. And
right.
isn't that what we typically leave it on for the next audit to show
Right.
that they cleared? And then we would say, yes, though, we concur with your methodology, yes, we concur, and yes, we concur.
Right, and
So
I've
I
got,
think we concur with
policies and
your-
stuff in place with the blue, but the red, until we sit down and do the CAFR next year, I can't say, yes, somebody else did it and I reviewed it, I can't.
Well, you can say you changed the procedure, though.
Yes, I can.
But weren't we also doing a verification on some of these things, having the auditors
We
kind of
pick,
go back?
we
Yeah,
pick
the ones
once a
we want,
year
yeah.
which one we want to
Back
send,
and check.
send them to.
Yeah, and the last two sheets I reviewed, the 17 and 18, are the external auditor. So those are from our CAFR, Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, not for the record.
Yeah, I skimmed all 276 pages of it.
Did you? Good job. Most people don't do that.
It's a quick
Talking
skim,
to
right?
the This is probably the only board that does
It
read
probably
it.
is. Or even skim it, I mean, seriously.
Yeah.
We wanna wait for 4, I'll keep it green, on the, capital projects process review. I'll keep it green, but we won't close anything with the Board of Supervisors yet. But I'll take the public guardian
Public
update,
guardian.
we'll close that all out,
Mhm.
and then I'll close the 17 audit finding as well.
Mhm.
Okay, just as a recap. Perfect, can I have a motion for that, so, anything to say as directed?
Yeah.
I think there's a
To,
proposed motion.
let me read it. Closure of the internal audit findings and recommendation included in the audit findings tracking report as presented and agreed by the audit committee.
For the public guardian,
Public guardian.
we're only sending
Yeah, that's it.
public guardian and closing of 2017 audit, external audit.
So noted.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
All in favor? It passes. Thank you. Okay, next item 6B, for possible action, presentation by IBM on risk assessment and audit, community consideration, discussion, possible recommendation on the future procedures.
record, Dan Carter. I'm the engagement partner on the city's internal audit. Everyone was provided a copy of our final risk assessment summary, as well as the, we had gone through that kind of color-coded scoring sheet in the meeting last time. I know there were some questions on the scoring sheet, kind of how we came up with some of those numbers, and I'll tell you, honestly, there's some subjectivity in those based on our conversations with people. But it is that first score, the public exposure score, is kind of a combination of of both the public exposure risk and the likelihood, so likelihood and impact. And it's public exposure in a public entity is kind of a weird thing to talk about because that's what you guys do. So the impact score for a lot of those was set at 6, basically assuming that everything you do is public, but not any more public than any other government. And then the likelihood score was kind of determined on a combination of areas related to public works, because some of them are, you deal with them every single day or multiple times a day, and some of them less so. So they ended up with a likelihood score of 9 and an impact score of 6 to get to that score of 54. And we're not, this is based on our analysis and our interviews with management and the directors of the departments. If there's concerns about any of these being too high or too low, or that we potentially missed something, I'm certainly open to that conversation as well.
So just from my understanding, the public works, different risks were evaluated by public works management?
So we started out with that questionnaire, and I think that was provided to the board as kind of a preliminary understanding of the pieces that fall into this risk assessment. And then for all these, especially these higher risk divisions, we talked to several people. Our internal auditors talked to several people within that organization, and based on their answers to our questions, we determined how risky or not risky they were by column. And across all the divisions, typically those conversations happened at the management or director level. We didn't get down into the staff level. And so based on that risk assessment, we have some potential, and our previous conversations at audit committee meetings, we have some potential future audits, kind of over the next FY19, FY20 audit period. Not sure if there are any of those that jump out as priorities over the next several months, or if there's any additional questions or concerns on any of that.
We just did that audit on public works, and that was the one that floated to the top, right?
Mm-hmm.
And we're doing a review of fire, and it looks like, I don't know, have we ever done anything in courts?
Yeah, we have. We did efficiency. My concern about the courts is, yeah, it is. We have no influence on them. They don't take our recommendations, so that's a lost cause to get involved with making, spending an audit and giving recommendations. They self-govern themselves.
Or they have to request it.
They have to, right, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, we spent on it a lot of time a few years ago, and really came with some good suggestions, and, internally, they just felt like, no, that wouldn't be effective, and so there's no sense in it. So I think we need to scratch them off the list.
And just exclude them for the risk assessment process
Yeah.
on a go-forward basis? Okay, no problem.
Yeah.
And
Like I
we,
said, unless they ask to be included.
yeah, and they are actually subject to, it's actually an agreed upon procedures engagement, but it's basically an audit of their procedures under the requirements of the Nevada Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
So they do have
That's their accountability.
Yeah, just.
I think they're going through that right now.
They are.
I'm just curious, who's the head of that area?
We deal with Maxine Cortez as the court administrator, and Karen Fisher is kind of our primary contact.
I would say elected judges that are really the top.
Oh, I'm sorry, and I think maybe, sorry, I was confused on the, so we've identified proposed internal audits, based on the risk assessment, but also based on what has previously been audited. So see, we don't really have public works or court in here.
Dan, did you guys use the whole 150 on the risk assessment?
We did not, no, we've got some wiggle room in some of these. I was gonna talk about that as we get into kind of where we are on fire and temporary staffing.
Okay.
But we do have some additional budget left over in that budget.
So really, you're on pages 8 and 9, these are basically the proposed plan or the menu we have.
Yes, yeah. And we had talked about some of these last time, you know, the social media audit and just making sure that there's policies and procedures in place for who's posting what to social media. It's kind of an unusual area that drops out, you know, citywide versus, you know, a particular department that scored high on the risk assessment, but it would cover several of those.
Based on our budget, how many hours would we be able to set aside for, you know, working on which of these projects?
So we've got a total budget of $1,550. That's where we came. That was based on our original proposal.
Okay.
So we basically feel like we could
Do
get
all
all
these
these
projects.
done
Okay.
over the next fiscal year.
So it's really whether we want to knock one out.
Yeah.
And put something else in there.
And when do you expect these to be completed by?
I mean, I think we'd line up that calendar depending on which ones we were.
Yeah, we gotta approve them first.
Well, yeah, no, but if we're to go forward, is this something that's, are we gonna be, 6 months, a year, or how far along? We kind of halfway.
Yeah, halfway.
Beyond halfway through the year already.
Yeah,
We
right.
haven't started this,
On the, maybe we can jump to one just as a discussion item on the tax exempt property audit. Is that, and you talked with the assessor?
We haven't done, I mean, other than the risk assessment questionnaire and the follow-up questions to that, we haven't done any kind of preliminary work on any of these to see what, you know, the controls and procedures in place at this point.
I think that one might be a good one to maybe move, and it may be even one if they have time this year to jump on, depending on where we are, like you said, this fiscal year.
Mhm.
What I tend to see happen a lot at the Board of Supervisors is we're constantly either trying to waive them, go back, and maybe it's just a timing issue that many of the entities that are tax exempt don't know they have to do a letter and request at the assessor's office, and then but it seems to me that one will just be a huge workflow and a procedure or something that, I don't know if it's during reporting of a property with a I don't know if there's just something you can help with the best practice
Absolutely,
because I know that I've had discussions with the assessor, who goes, hey, it's their responsibility. Well, okay, but the workload it creates to have to then waive it or bring it if the tax roll closed and things like that. So I think it's also could potentially, it's a good service that we can provide to the community to find a best way to implement it. And I know there's a couple of items that, another conflict or something with state law, or what we just had on the charter school. You know, is it or isn't it taxable once they exit it, right? So the Argent school,
Mhm.
so they're no longer holding school anymore, but just because the public entity owns it, but do they have to be doing the nonprofit activity to continue to tax it? And so I think there's a lot of issues around this that potentially could be of service, but I want to make sure that the assessor is going to welcome the help and the procedure. I'm trying
We're here to help. That's-
I'm trying to be kind here in the discussion, because I think it would help both his office and the general public on, you know, here's the rules, here's the forms, apply by such and such a date to avoid having to get it waived, or coming before the Board of Supervisors to clear the air, or blah, 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 blah.
Yeah.
So I would say over our agenda, the last few years, I've seen quite a few that all deal with tax exempt properties.
So they're like post, they're kind of after the fact?
They get their tax bill and say, what is this? Why do I owe 40? That's what happened on the school, was, what's this? I owe $40,000? What are you talking about? We're a school. Well, no, you're not. You're not operating because the charter school was closed. So you don't have a public purpose anymore. So now the building's taxable. Well, no, it's not. I'm still a school. Well, no, anyway, I think it's a great case to look at.
So the assessor's elected as well. Do you want me to reach out to him and see if how open he is to the procedures before we guide Bailey to do it, or do we want to just say let's do it?
Don't they technically report it to the Board of Supervisors, even though they're elected, or no?
Well, there's pieces. He's the one that's gonna make a tax determination, but the Board of Supervisors, you have couple of methods, right? Some goes to your Board of Equalization when somebody wants to dispute the work of the assessor. They go to the Board of Equalization, which then can go to the State Board of Equalization. If a tax roll is closed, the Board of Supervisors will then refund. We've done everything. We've refunded, we've reversed, I mean, there's lots of action. So I just don't know. Again, I think there's some value there for the public too. That would help, because I don't know that there's a lot of stuff on the website that tell, or again, if there's any process in which the city could notify someone on a land transfer. Oh, by the way, because that's the other thing that happens a lot, I buy a tax exempt property and I'm gonna continue it, but I'm the new owner, I have to go in and apply, it doesn't carry. And they don't realize that, and so then they get the animal services, right? We had to reverse 16,000 or something, whoa, to apply again. So I think it's a good one to look at. I don't think it hurts to reach out to the assessor to say, yes, we're here to help.
Okay.
We're here to help.
Okay.
And how much information would you need to give to the assessor? I mean, should we draft the audit program for the committee's review that then goes to him, or do you want to just tell him this is kind of what we're thinking? I mean, how much detail do you think he needs to say?
I'd like to have the assessor tell us he welcomes it, and that before you spend hours to find out that he doesn't welcome it or doesn't find value. Because he thinks everything's already well documented, procedures are well in place. You know, maybe he doesn't. I'd like to reach out to him, and then maybe we can.
And it's more a procedural review of what he's doing, more so than a detailed testing, right?
No,
No.
necessarily.
Yeah, that's a good question. And then we could do some analysis of whether those properties are identified properly and.
Mhm. Mhm. So I don't know about, what do you guys think? Should we talk to him first?
I think it would be beneficial to talk to him first.
I think you need to talk to him, but at the same time, I mean, there might be some efficiencies or something that he just doesn't recognize that, you know, so if he's opposed to the process, you know, how would we handle that, you know? Do we,
Come talk to us.
yeah.
You can come talk to us if he's opposed.
So I guess we need to submit to him some type of a plan, what we're gonna be doing.
General.
Yeah,
General areas of consideration, maybe not an audit plan.
yeah. Yeah, I don't think we want to give him an audit plan, we just, yeah.
Mhm. I don't, like I said, I don't want to spend 30 hours against
Yeah.
something and then we all agree not to do it. Right. Okay.
One thing I've noticed on here, I know in the past we've had the fraud hotline, how, is that being monitored anymore, what's happening with that?
It is, yeah. We haven't had any calls. I think last meeting we talked about maybe trying to test it because it's been silent.
I just saw.
Yeah.
You didn't get
I
anything?
don't think we got any.
Oh, that's bad. I will get in touch with Lighthouse and find out what's going on.
Yeah, make sure that.
Because we tested it and it didn't work, that's what you're saying.
Also too, that it might be good, I know in the past we've done some things to help promote and let the public and employees, staff know that it's out there, so maybe we need to do something and, you know, get involved with that, just so they know that's available,
Mhm.
and if they see anything, because I think that is a great tool.
Yeah, how is it, Marcus?
It's all
I
over
mean,
our
somebody-
website,
Yeah.
it's all over the city's website, the
Okay.
fraud hotline.
But do we send out a memo saying it's available there, like new employees or whatever, people forgotten about that it was there?
I
Send
don't
employees
know.
though, but it's outside, but it's I noticed that the state sent out a annual reminder.
Oh, there's a policy that everybody has to read.
Okay, good.
For the employees, right?
And they
Yes.
sign on.
Yes.
I think in the past, there were times when they would do almost like a little presentation or something like that, just to let the employees know, just awareness every once in a while, it probably needs to be done. And that's the way to just kind of like, you know, it's like beating the bushes a little bit, to see if there's something out there, and if not, you feel like, wow, okay, there's, you know, we've gone, we made that presentation, we haven't heard anything. So it's-
Right, and for a policy, the fraud, waste, and abuse policy has to be read every couple of years.
Yeah.
So the employees are constantly updated and reminded of the policy on the hotline.
Put flyers in the restrooms. We know it works great. Well, the rest stop. Really great feedback.
Sit there, got a lot of time on their hands.
I have a question on these proposed internal audit areas.
Uh-huh.
How does it relate to this heat map?
So basically, we've got the risks, the riskier areas identified, but, you know, like Steve was saying, some of these have been beat up pretty good over the last few years. We definitely reviewed the work of the prior internal auditor. So they're kind of combination of individual areas of the city as well as citywide. And some of these are citywide, like the first 4 would cover several of those departments in one audit with a specific issue. So we're not looking department by department for some of these. They'd be covering multiple departments and their policies and procedures across those, like our temporary staffing. We talked to multiple departments within the city versus our fire overtime was specific to the fire department, so.
Hey, Dan, that brings the question, 1,550 hours for the year, for the entire audit year, right? And we're in, you guys remember hours in on fire and temporary staffing? But
Yeah.
They aren't on here, so.
Yeah, so
Because it's this year.
we're crossing fiscal years. Last year, we kind of got a late start with the finalization of the contract, you know, over the summer, and then, so we've only, the 2 projects we worked on last year, we're kind of considering last fiscal year.
Okay,
Um,
gotcha. So that was 18.
Yeah, kind of the previous, yeah. Although we did, I mean, at this point, we crossed into 1920.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman. Maybe I can ask, I really like the social media one. I mean, Eric's smiling, but I really think that we need this one, again, for some best practices, for policies to be developed. And I know, it doesn't matter, but I know several situations in which I've seen postings and I don't know that they were approved in advance. And then we get to answer them. Anyway, I really think this is a big one. And I think in the age that's upon us, that everybody thinks, oh, it's cool, I'll just go tweet or I'll post on Facebook or I'll do something, and they sometimes don't realize the impact of their lovely posting. You know, that everybody didn't interpret it exactly the same way. And so I think this one is a really good one that will be a benefit, long-lasting benefit to us to, again, get a structure, get a policy, and things of that nature. So I really like the social media one. And I don't think that interferes with our ERP. It doesn't interfere with all the other stuff that they're trying to do. So I think that one, again, should really move up to the top, unless Eric's smiling at me, but am I on the right track here?
Yeah.
Because it won't interfere with everything else you're trying to accomplish.
So Eric Von Schimmelman, Chief Information Officer for the record. So on the social media policy, yes, I agree, it's a good thing. So actually, it's sitting at the DA's office, what we've started. But I would welcome any help. We've started a policy, we've reached out to the DA, having them review it right now, so. It's in the works, but getting
Best
this
practices and
would
other-
help us out and getting it enforced citywide.
So that's something that can move to the, again, not knowing where you're sitting on the other, but is that one you can get on maybe even with the proposed manual? Is that one you can move to the top of the?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I'm just thinking back about the work we've done so far. And typically what we're trying to do is if there's policies and procedures in place, test against those to what's currently going on. But if there's.
Or create
Yeah,
it.
we're creating
Yeah.
it. So we have a very old social media policy that we were updating and working with the DA on, updating to the current standards.
Okay.
Is that almost done, 50% done?
It's, well, so we started with very basic, modifying what we had. And the DA's had a few changes, so I don't even know if Todd realizes it's sitting on the list. So that's why he's looking at me going, it's on my stack today.
I'll have to talk to Eric and
Yeah.
Danny about it.
Well, and then talk with Dan, again, is this the right thing that you're envisioning and they're envisioning? So we come to the, I want to use your dollars well.
Yeah.
And find out, is it that you want to wait till it's been implemented for a year and then you're going to randomly pull 20 posts and say, did it follow the procedure? Would
So
that
things-
even be helpful?
Well, that's,
I mean, I
we're
don't know.
still writing the
Right.
new policy, so things are not, we know things aren't following current policy, and that's where we started with this and trying to enforce that. So, and if you have best practices, we've gathered our own, but I think that's where it would be helpful.
Didn't you
Creating
mention before
those.
that you had done some work in specific?
We have for like that, yeah.
That's why I think it should be introduced now as opposed to waiting.
Right.
Because, I mean, technically, we have an old policy that states we're gonna come up with a new one, and they can,
Yeah.
they're strength.
Absolutely. There's maybe not much to test on the back end as far as, I mean, it may not take us the full 100 hours.
Right.
It's just, here's what other governments your size are doing on social media policy. And yes, there's some inappropriate posts out there. I mean, I'm not sure, there won't be much testing, I guess, but maybe that's not, at this point, what you're looking for, it's better
Yeah.
just to get it in
That's
place up
kind
front.
of
help.
looking at, we know things are going out that
Yeah.
shouldn't be going out. And put guidelines around that, who can approve postings and
Absolutely.
so,
Yeah.
and we have a dedicated person for social media in the city. She's a digital media coordinator, but also does.
Well, let me ask
most
you
of
this
it.
slightly.
Yeah, she's an employee of IT.
You're right.
That's why it falls under
Okay, I see.
IT, so.
If I looked at this and said, so maybe it's really a two-pronged, so one, you're gonna work potentially with the DA's office and Eric to see if there's any other best practices and things that your IT teams, I know Eide Bailey has some super teams out there that work in these arenas and to really help us there, and then save half of the hours to wait 6 months from the implementation of it, and then test it for us. If that makes sense, I see it really as a two-prong, right?
Yeah.
Say, hey, the city now has this new policy, they put it out, the edict, and then 6 months later, you go and say, okay, did the staff understand it, are they adhering to it? Did we get it clear enough and concise enough that everyone can adhere? And so I see actually splitting this one into a two-prong.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Okay. Thanks, Sarah.
I have a question, on the accounts payable audit. This is a re-audit, I would assume, we just did this about 2 years ago.
It was 2016.
Yeah, I mean, this is something that came up in our risk assessment, it's still being high, so.
Wouldn't this
not-
always be high though? This type of a department?
Yes, yeah. I'm not sure, I would consider, I'm not sure, when I think re-audit, I think go back to the prior findings and make sure they're clear. We'd probably start from scratch or not, yeah.
Especially with the new system coming in.
Yes, yeah. We did talk a little bit about network
So would we do that
security.
later? Would we want to?
After
I
you.
don't, I think it would be worthwhile after the new system.
After the new system.
1 year. I kind of see maybe a little bit like the social media one, but I really see that as
It's been
1 year after implementation, kind of like the public guardian, right? we wanted to give the new public guardian one, so she'll spend 2019 adhering to what the new rules were, and then you'll go back a year later and test her and say, you got it, not quite, or, and so I kind of see these the same way, because we did accounts payable at the end of 16, 17, so would we implement the ERP and then come hit it to say, did all of the, I just can't see spending the money there if there's somewhere else that we could put that 200 hours that gains us something maybe we haven't looked at yet.
Does that apply to the revenue and?
Actually, the revenue one I see, or not the revenue, I'm sorry, I meant audit.
Fee structure.
The
That
fee
one-
structure
That seems to me that.
we should do.
We should do, yeah.
We've already talked about that.
Yeah, that one we already agreed at the last one was one we wanted to accomplish for sure.
So, Sherry, is accounts payable going live on July 1st?
July 1st, 19, yep,
So if we
2019.
waited the 1 year, it would be in the 20 work plan.
It'd be in
I
the
don't-
2021.
I mean, to me, it's high enough risk. I would, you know, if you're into it and the amount of payables that we're cranking through that, you know, if it was something where we were looking at in
Last
September or
month.
October, you know, the earlier the better, because if there's any issues, it's gonna be critical that we catch
I mean, on
them. I mean,
that they would have already implemented, you mean, and have some error in the ERP
Right.
system that's missing a control?
and we had some fairly relevant findings in 2017, right? Yeah. There was a couple of duplicate payments, and we better make sure that the new system is buttoning those issues out sooner rather than later.
And to your point, there's a decent population within that first quarter of the year.
Yeah. Maybe last half,
Do it the last half of the year.
fourth quarter of
That's
this
6
year.
months worth of data.
Mhm.
Yeah.
AP is the kind of thing you almost want to cycle through every few years anyway. So, if we, yeah.
Okay.
And talk about the citywide budget monitoring.
Yeah, that's one we had talked about kind of previously in the audit committee meeting, and I know Sherry was nodding her head at that time. Just, you know, the finance department does a good job of monitoring the budget as a whole, but not sure that makes its way out on a department by department level.
Mhm.
We've definitely got a lot of people, department heads and managers who maybe aren't as financially savvy, and just making sure that they're managing to the budget and that the budget makes sense, how it's being, you know, determined. That was certainly part of our fire program. We'll talk about that a little bit later. But just making sure that the budgets are developed reasonably and that people are managing to those budgets versus just finance making sure that
So
they're
right now,
covering expenditures.
who holds the various departments responsible for the budgets?
Finance does.
Finance?
If they are over budget, we definitely ask them why or have them transfer line items so that at the end of the day, they stay within the budget.
Or just augment.
Well, if necessary, I mean, there's a whole review process for augmentations. IFC, they have to come to the board. Yeah, we don't hand out money lightly.
No, absolutely. I mean, it does happen.
We gave her a good nickname at the Board of Supervisors, so it works. The Dragon Lady. So, you know, you gotta watch that budget, no. So the first answer is no. Right.
In auditing the city budget, are we considering like performance measures? I know we did a lot of work on that in the past, and are we looking at it as far as their performance as well?
Yeah, I think we're in the middle of tweaking the performance measures and how we're gonna implement that going forward. But yeah, I mean, we definitely look at every year what they've used and what they didn't use and tweak things accordingly.
Because I think we were trying to really get that very systematic and the metrics out there so we kind of like monitor it. And I see a lot of the internal control thing that auditors love, you know, but there's the performance thing. I think we need to kind of like get that back in there, tie that in so that we can take a look at it and how they perform, are they really meet their mission and their purpose, and how do you tie it, you know, that the dollars have to be able to be, or that has to justify the dollars or the increases.
Yeah.
You know, Michael, it's funny, we just went through an exercise that we did in our retreat, and Supervisor Bonkowski and myself worked on our CSSG and tried to implement our first really tying dollars to a performance, just what you're talking about. So we had taken our health assessment, our CHIP, and for the first time, really come through there and said, we're gonna implement the health indicators and try and make a difference on what we wrote in this report that said these are the health issues that Carson City faces. And we took our community support dollars and said, we're gonna meet these mission critical ones, and we're gonna look over a 5-year period and really ascertain whether or not putting so much money for dental, children's dental, are we making a difference? Is it, are they doing better in school? Are we getting the indicators that the health assessment questionnaires said that we need to address mental health, we need to address these issues? And so I think that was the city's first real foray into matching the dollars to the performance and trying to say we're gonna hit a strategic goal and actually do that. So I think we're just coming right at a good point in that program to say, did this work? Did we
Yeah, about another year, yeah.
yeah, did we do this, and are we on the right path? And then we can take that model and start, and say, okay, we've got to tweak it a little bit, this kind of worked well, we missed a little over here, and then start moving that same mechanism throughout everything that we do, so that if one of the departments comes in and said, so one of the next ones we're working on, the fire department wants to do 4-minute response time, and they're hitting 4 minutes, 24 seconds, something like that. And start saying, okay, it's time to put the next fire department, and then we put the goals to that. So I think we're trying hard to match where possible. I don't think everything in a budget matches to a performance indicator. Because some things you have to supply whether or not, you have to assess the properties, you have to. But I certainly think all, yeah, you can shift the dollars that aren't tied to a specific NRS or something to hit a goal, is what you're talking about.
So we've got some, like ongoing administration. I guess I'd kind of like to, I mean, in the past, we always had a portion of our internal audit would be looking at performance and really, doing that. So I guess I would like to see I would like to see what some of those indicators are. What are the 3 or 4 things for each of the departments that was really important that we can measure it and then monitor it, and then just as we get this status report, it would be neat to just have our performance report, where you just have it. So I'd say we have, the one's really more for the internal control and the special projects they're doing, but focus it back on the performance. And
are we providing good service
yes,
to the citizens?
yeah, and not only that, but it helps. Well, it helps the staff and the supervisors to be able to come back to the community. This is what's happening. This is what we're doing. We've got some, objective measurement here. Okay, but I know that
this is why we're going in the direction we're
right,
going.
and we'll continue on with this because we see, hey, our performance is getting better by putting in X amount of more dollars. So we'll continue to do that. But yeah, having it, and maybe just starting out with, like you were saying, small, do a few, and then boom, we start to expand. But I guess I'd kind of like to see where we're getting at on our regular reports.
So right now, are there performance metrics that go to the board of supervisors that are reported out?
No.
I think we can ask.
Yeah,
that.
so what I wanted to do. So Socrata, who is the company that we use for the software, they are actually going to be coming out in the next few months, and they're going to do a redesign of our performance dashboard. I think some of you had seen a presentation of that before, or a demonstration. So what we're going to do with the departments is develop metrics for the departments to use that will help the departments and the board to make budget decisions. We're going to review what we're measuring right now. Is it a relevant metric? Is it meaningful? Is it going to help us make operational decisions? And then we also thought about maybe adding in what kind of data the public would like to see. So that's a process that we'll be getting started with in the next few months.
Okay.
Just to give you an update on that.
So for our internal auditor, then, I guess we'll just basically, what I'm suggesting is we start to have that kind of report, and there might be just one little thing, but at least have something where once you get that information, we start to get that, here's the different departments, here's the metrics, and here it was at this point, and here it is now. And we just follow that. And because I know we've worked on this a lot in the past, And it just seems like it
Yeah.
keeps, you know, the whole idea was to be able to tie your budget as much as possible to
Right.
performance. And have a very systematic and an easy way to do that. So that's my dream.
I think we've done a little bit more now that my mind's coming here too, that one of the other areas, like, I serve on RTC, so one of the things we did in RTC is we really worked through with the streets and determining, again, a best practice and a good model for, so we ended up developing a region 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 or whatever, and really trying to say, we're gonna maintain, that's a number count, 60 on all the streets, and that we were fairly and proportionately doing it throughout our whole community, so that we didn't just keep going back and fixing these same 3 or 4 roads, and then this area didn't get any attention. And so I think that was another great performance based model that we used, that in a few years we should again test it and say, did we get the roads in the right regions? Did we fairly distribute, and did that help us make better decisions? Because the other model on that was supposed to be, we're not gonna do a road project and then turn around a year later and do a sewer project on it, and then 2 years later do a water project on it. So that's a huge performance that we're working on in the public works arena, is to have roads only cut once in the 5-year period of time or something. So there's a huge performance matrix that we did through that committee.
Is that the pavement management?
Mhm.
Asset management.
Yeah.
Kind of look at that, how many miles per
Yes.
dollar.
Well, and then it does
You know,
it, right, it
those are
does an
easy.
actual grading of the road to say,
Yeah.
okay, this road's a 60, this one's a 70, this one's a whatever, and we're using that to help us put, if I have $1 million to spend this year, where's my best use of that $1 million, instead of just saying it's the person that yelled the loudest about their potholes. It's, no, this is the road that's at a 40, so
Right.
that's the one we're gonna do, and we're gonna go all the way around the community. So I think we're implementing some of it, documenting it, and knowing that we're doing it. It's 2 different things.
Yeah,
I think you're on the right.
So if we get that documentation from our
Mhm.
internal auditor and we get some feedback on that, we know what's going on here, then we can kind of, and also too, the performance thing could also be part of how we determine what areas we look at. You know,
Mhm.
that's another thing as far as the risk assessment, understanding how it's performing, maybe those low performers, but you know, what's happening there.
Why aren't we
And,
getting this much?
Yeah, so,
Yeah.
and it's good too, I think that everybody knows that, you know, it's not just meeting the budget, but it's also performing, you
Well, it's
know.
a service to the community.
Exactly.
We have a method for, I think that's what we really wanted on the RTC, is we wanted a methodology for selecting, because I gotta tell you, we get, oh my gosh, there's hundreds of roads and they all need to be fixed. You know, there isn't a road in town that wouldn't qualify to be fixed, so that we had solid data to make this decision. And so I think it's a good.
So it sounds like there's a couple performance measurement projects going on,
Using.
and then there's the dashboard that
Mhm.
is kind of separate to that piece.
Right.
And then where do you see us?
Well, I think when we have the dashboard, it's a matter of, I mean, I guess, I'd see as, you would be kind of getting the dashboard and taking a look at it, and then being able to, you know, distill it down to us, like what's going on. I mean, I haven't seen the dashboard in a few, I would think we'd see the dashboard every meeting, you know? So I think that's where I just incorporate, we get the dashboard from her, and then as we're learning what's going on, there's these projects, then get that stuff in there, and then what metrics are being used for the different, I think just being able to talk about it, we can then start to drive this thing forward. But right now, we've got, like you pointed out, we've got different pieces. We've got this going on here, we've got that going over there. We've got the dashboard, as I remember, that was really good. And we maybe
It just
need
needs to be updated.
It needs to be updated, and I think when we left it last, some of the metrics in there was kind of questionable. You know, what's
Yeah.
really
Being counted
important.
here.
Exactly.
Mhm.
So yeah, I just say that it's basically, they're doing the work, just if you just sort of summarize it for us, and then we can kind of look at it and make decisions about
We're a
it.
few,
By
we're
summarize it, you mean?
a few months out
How
on
about
doing
it's-
this.
Audit though.
No, I'm not saying audit, I think at this point,
Just
we just got
report
the
back
report.
all the different pieces
Yeah,
that are going
pieces,
on,
but
just
I
so
see-
that this committee knows.
Exactly, yeah, so you get maybe it's just a matter of printing off their dashboard, and giving it to us in our package. Yeah, if we got that, and then we have something to discuss and look at, and then Lori would maybe say something, oh, this is not on here, this is what's going on, or, so we can start to see what's happening.
Well, then don't you see the auditor again? So, something from the past life, what we would do is, so the department that enters in their data and says, pretend, who cares? I was supposed to do 15 widgets or 15 miles of, no, I got a better one, that we just did at RTC, it was kind of fun. We have 1,000 trees in the city that have to be monitored to make sure they're not interfering with power poles and people driving and things like that. And so your performance is what percentage of the trees are you getting trimmed or even just looked at to make sure that you catch them before they're a problem, right? The better idea is to look at the tree before the public calls you up and says, great, we just had an accident because the trees, you can't see. So that you test. That's really what I see their role would be able to go behind it and say, I can validate the data that was reported. That's what I think their job actually would be, is to validate that no numbers just being typed in there. That they have a report or something to substantiate the number.
Yeah, that's where you come, first of all, we gotta get the report.
Right, and then.
So as we start to see that, then we go, then, that's exactly right. Then it's a matter of going back and checking those numbers behind there. Because it's those department heads.
Right.
They're gonna be doing, so we're trying to give them some feedback on what's going on. So this is to help them get some information what's going on. So part of it is just making sure, yeah, they're getting the numbers in right, they're doing it properly. And that there's a uniformity, you
Well,
know?
and then that's a standing work so I actually see that as a standing job,
Yeah.
right? That once we're implemented, then they would just be randomly picking the next whatever that's
Yeah.
in there and saying, okay, I'm gonna go validate those ones. And then the next quarter you go validate them, right? But I see that as actually a standing job, that you can come back and say, hey, those are good numbers that were reported to the public. It's not just that it's numbers, they were validated numbers. So do you see that as a standing committee? work?
Yeah, well, and I think something we discussed in the past is that
Yeah.
we can almost, I mean, I think the number I had in my mind, I believe was discussed, probably about 30% of this budget is really looking for monitoring, measuring, and getting the performance out. But that's a really big part of it. As a matter of fact, in the earlier days, we did more performance, and
Right.
we were ignoring internal control.
Right,
And I was like,
now
we
we
need to get
shift
back
to
to internal
internal
control.
control
So we're
and-
going back and forth, and I guess we kind of want to balance out and kind of get where in our projects, we're getting more of that performance and keeping it. So it's more of a routine, systematic cycling through year after year.
Right.
And there's a stability to it, so, so.
Okay. Well, and that way the number's not just out there either, that there's a value to it and that we're forced to look at it.
Right.
Because is your dashboard external, Lisa,
Yes.
or just internal? It is.
It's external.
Yeah, to the public.
It's out
Yeah.
there for everybody.
Mhm. So I like it being validated.
Yeah.
But we'd have to wait till that new or is this something we can start on now, or?
I think we need to wait because the dashboard we have right now hasn't been updated recently. So what we're doing is we're having each of the department directors think of, 2 to 3 things that they think would be meaningful to measure. And then we're having Socrates coming out to do an update of the dashboard. Yeah.
What is their role in this? Is it just more of the development of the software, or do they kind of critique as far as these measurements and say, yeah, this is a valid metric and
I guess there's a reason why it's stayed here.
Yeah.
Yeah. So Socrata is the overall company. They help us design it. We bring in what we want to measure. So currently, the measures were set based off the strategic goals of the city on the strategic plan. So they were all based off that. Since then, Socrata has changed their philosophy on the back end, because when we initially bought it, we had 40 measures that we were allowed to do. Now they've changed philosophy. We can do unlimited measures because they realize now it's more based on performance and how to tie that back to the budgeting. So, and we're going to update the site to match and coincide with their new back end that allows us to do a lot more detail in the back end and more better calculations to get us the
More
right
detail, you're saying having more measures? For
We can do
each
more
department?
measures. We can do, it'll give you more detail on how the measures were created.
Okay.
And how to
Back
count
in-
it,
And
how
how,
to
and how to
complete it.
update them, how to,
Yeah.
how to get it over there. Because that was one of the issues that we had with the current system, is it's a manual process to take a software package that you're using to do trees
Right.
and upload it. You had to do something. You had to send a file to somebody to upload it into the system or train somebody to do that. And we went through a lot of staff changes, so it kind of got very stale.
Got left beside. So really, it's gonna be more of an automatic upload
So,
of data.
in the future, we're looking at getting it automatic.
Good. So
They
that's,
updated.
that's where the auditors then come in, to kind of take a look at getting
So-
inside and looking at, making sure everything is.
So they'll have to look at,
Eventually,
are they gonna look at
validate
at the
things.
base system first and say, okay, Socrata, so they'll have to know what the iTree application is
Mhm.
compared to what we're showing to the
Yeah.
public, is that what,
Do they match?
do they match?
So it's kind of
That's-
going through, checking a few measures and making sure from here, and all that stuff.
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right, well, that's good. So when do you expect them to roll out the new
So-
dashboard?
Well, so it's a very long process, and I'm currently working on it, but we've got a contract what we're working on with them, and it kind of stalled out about 3 months ago, because I've focused efforts on ERP with the department, the staff that I have right now.
Well,
So-
this is tied into the ERP though, isn't it?
No, well, yes and no.
Yeah, because-
So Socrata was bought out by Tyler Technologies, who we bought for the ERP. So, and ERP is covering a lot of stuff. We keep saying ERP, but utility billing really isn't an ERP, but that's part of our ERP implementation because we included it, because ERP is really just the financial portion. If you look at it in detail, the financial and payroll. We've got utility billing, we've got a whole land management and building permit system that we're implementing with that as well. So, but Tyler Technologies has bought up a lot of other companies as well. We're doing a sheriff's civil system that is owned by Tyler Technology as well at the same time. So probably about 3 months before I can get started on that. And they were gonna come out and it's gonna be the first week, or it was like, I think it was 8 days to implement one department. And that's just with like 3 basic measures that we go through in detail with them on how to update.
Well,
So-
I value small stars and getting it started.
Yep.
That's a big thing in seeing some.
Small steps.
Well, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to recommend that maybe we just have it as a standing item on the agendas, that every time we get together, we follow up on this and get a status report on how it's developing. And then at the point where our internal auditors can then maybe get a little bit more involved with it. But
Yeah, I was looking back on the audit tracker, and there was a performance measurement
Mhm.
development in 2015.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Mhm.
That's what we started with.
And that's, I think, at the beginning of this dashboard, yeah. So that's what.
That's where we started the dashboard.
Yeah, and it was good, and it worked, you know, and then nothing was followed up on after that. So yeah, if we had that as a standing item, review our performance, how this is coming along, and then how we can direct our internal
So
audit.
who's gonna own the performance dashboard from a city perspective? Is it gonna be IT or is it,
Probably the city manager's office
Okay.
will take the lead on that, as far as getting the information in there.
Yeah, we're gonna step
So,
up.
well-
Her. Yeah. So now I'll raise my hand.
So she'll be responsible for the numbers.
yeah.
Sherry's like, oh, thank God, that's not my name. That's her name. Okay.
So does anybody disagree with that? Just a status update for future audit committee meetings until we get to the point where the dashboard's implemented. So, progress updates as we reach out to the staff.
So one of the issues with the current dashboard that we have is a lot of the measures are measured annually. So That's why
change
they haven't
very
changed.
often.
Yeah, they don't change very often. The only one I think that changes on a monthly basis or even quarterly was the sheriff's office. So,
Is that the direction for the future, annual measurements, or like?
No.
No, I think
No.
it'll be more live, right?
No, it's like, and that was one of the issues we realized when we did this, a lot of measures were just annual, so it didn't give us anything throughout the
Yeah.
year to do any budgeting with. It was like, okay, hey, this is how good we did.
See, I didn't know that, I didn't realize that happened, so we got it going, and then boom, we didn't follow up.
Yeah. And it came through as we watched this thing evolve, and then people look at it and look how they were updating the system. And I went to about an annual update for each measure, and I think there's 18 out there right now.
So I don't think, are we, Michael, you're proposing any audit time go to this performance measurement this year?
I think what he has is he's got 200 ongoing. I don't know how we can direct it at this point. We don't know how things are
So
gonna.
table it for the future.
Table it, but possibly if nothing else, he can just report back to us, even if he doesn't, if there's nothing, just how it's going on, talk with him.
Yeah, I can update you, we can have an item and I can come and update
Yeah, 'cause
the progress briefly.
We're leaving 200 hours for administration, so we
Yeah.
can wait and see if that one will allocate
Yeah.
during the year to say, whoop, this is bubbled up or something we weren't right, unless I'm reading this one wrong. It was to,
Special projects, yeah.
200 was to save for special.
Yep.
So it doesn't sound like there's anything on the list that's not, that people think is, not worth doing at this point.
We're just
I mean,
gonna check with
timing
Dave on the
wise,
one with
yeah.
the assessor.
Hey, Sherry, just a quick question, is the budgeting, do you guys use separate budgeting software from the finance system right now?
No,
No?
we use the same software
Okay,
for the
and then
finance
with the
system.
new ERP, the budgeting software is,
Yep,
okay.
it's all gonna be tied in.
I was just looking
Is it
at that
better?
from, no, I was looking at
Yeah.
that from a timing
It'll make our
perspective.
budgeting process a lot easier.
Good.
Yeah.
Because it kind of looks like the fee structure, we could probably, tee up before the end of June. Assuming the assessor's office is open to it, we could, because these are kind of outside the ERP, right? Potentially even the revenue and accounts receivable on it wouldn't technically, you wouldn't have to worry too much about the ERP side of that,
Yeah.
I wouldn't think.
No, yeah, you're right. We'll have to look at how much budget we have left in fiscal year 19, because he's got 2 projects going, plus the risk assessment, plus he's got the cybersecurity that was approved as well
Right.
for fiscal 19.
Okay.
So we'll have to,
Mhm.
yeah. So I don't want to throw too much at him and then we end up being over budget in internal audit.
Or no, I mean-
No, you're the dragon lady, that won't happen.
Yeah. And network security tools again, 1920, it sounds like. We had talked about it, but then it was the state, moving off the state system. Yeah.
Okay, any other discussion on the audit plan as it stands right now? I don't think there's any motions to.
There is, actually, can you make a motion to accept the risk assessment that has been done and performed? And move forward with the procedures as discussed today?
It's kind of an ongoing thing, right? It's a living, is this something we'll update this as things change, right? So is it something doable?
Well, I think you guys have talked before about doing it every 3 years. Because I don't
The
think
risk
they're gonna.
assessment itself?
Yeah.
Yes, the risk assessment itself,
Not-
Risk
Yeah.
assessment.
right.
The attached,
Well, maybe-
not
maybe-
ABCs, attachment.
So on the
A.
staff report that we provide, there's a proposed motion.
Okay. Well, let me get some clarity from you. You get.
No, it doesn't
Oh,
mean you
it doesn't
have to
mean
do
we have to
it.
do
I just
one.
wasn't sure
Right,
if
right.
you guys
The
were
risk
aware.
assessment, you've got 150 hours in this.
Yeah, I mean, I think as things come up and as conversations happen and as we deal with
Close that.
departments, we certainly have the ability to adjust that on an ongoing basis and report back to
Okay.
the audit committee. I think as it stands right now, I think we're good with it to move forward with these projects.
All right.
And then maybe there's people that drop off. We talked about removing the courts. And maybe we find issues that other people raise up and next year we'll report back updated risk assessment.
Mhm.
Any other discussion on the risk assessment as it stands right now? If not, get a motion for approval.
I'll move to accept the risk assessment as presented.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. Sorry.
No.
Legal.
All right, next item, 6C.
So just wanted to circle back with the audit committee, kind of as an update of where we are at this point, preliminary potential findings and recommendations, and then maybe some direction on a go-forward basis. So at this point, we've completed both the audit programs that were presented to the committee at the last meeting for both fire and temporary staffing, fire overtime and temporary staffing. We have some additional room in the budget if there is direction for, great, based on what you found, could you check this also? I mean, we're actively engaged in, with the fire department, and so if there's additional stuff you guys want done on these, we have budget and people available to work on that at this point. So I thought we could kind of run through, maybe we'll start with fires, tell you guys kind of what we found and where we are, and we can talk about temporary staffing and then stop me at any point with questions.
Sure.
So we, like I said, we completed the audit program that was originally presented. We did interview a whole handful of people. We obtained a significant amount of documentation from the city. Thank you to Sherry for uploading hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents to our portal. And then, went out and did our internal control testing, pulled samples and verified them back to the various documentation or contracts that we had. For fire specifically, from a high level, we found lots of good documentation and lots of policies and procedures in place, or good solid policies and procedures in place. And we did test a sample of 20 overtime transactions and found all but one to be in compliance with policies and procedures. So basically we did a judgmental sample of 20 people. We selected 7 employees where they had callback and overtime on the same day. And we had 13 where employees had multiple overtime entries in the system in one day. It looked unusual to us, and based on our original audit program, thought that those should be an area of focus. We verified the overtime to the staffing and callback procedures, and then also obtained support for approval. That's done in IntelliStaff. There's training logs, national fire incident report, and dispatch reports. And so again, found those 20 transactions, 19 of the 20 transactions to be in compliance with policies and be supported by documentation. The one error we did find was more of a calculation error. So in the staffing and callback procedure, firefighters aren't allowed to work more than 24 hours of overtime. But there is a lot of data that goes into that. Some of those people are in training and then pulled out of training to cover a shift at a fire department or at a fire station, and then switch fire stations. And so some of those people can have multiple entries as far as their overtime, and they all need to be added up to make sure that they don't go over 24. We did find that to be the case, with the exception of one that ended up hitting 27 hours of overtime, and was just an exception. The business manager out of the fire department normally checks those, it slips through the cracks. We did ask.
Was it 24 per week or per period?
I think it's 24 at one time, like per overtime shift. That's the overtime shift, is 24 hours.
Because they work 24-hour shifts.
Okay.
And
So
yeah,
you can't do 27 in a 24-hour
Yeah.
period, that's what he's saying.
Makes sense, yeah.
Right, you're saying, hey, wait a minute, he got paid for 27, there's only 24 hours.
But we did document that as an isolated incident. We do have the detail of it, but the other 19 transactions we found to be in line with policies and procedures and supported by documentation. We did go back and do some high-level budget analysis and kind of labor burden analysis. And there is, the city does pay a lot of money in overtime benefits to employees. The original budget, and we're working with the department a little bit, they had a question to us about how to better budget. The original budget is the same number, has historically been the same number for the last 4 or 5 years. And then I think that's one that gets augmented.
It does
as
based
they
on the
go.
wildland fire revenue.
Yeah.
So are you talking about the budget for overtime or just total budget?
Budget for overtime specifically.
$100%.
Yeah. And we did not check, we talked about this later, we did not check the revenue side of this. That wasn't kind of in our original audit program. And that could be an area of focus on a go-forward basis is how much of the expenditures for overtime were reimbursed by another agency or the federal government. We could look into that process a little bit, but so the original budget typically is in the $700,000-800,000 range. And actual overtime ends up being in kind of the $1.2 to $1.4 million range. And it's, so we're talking about 40% more than original budget, and it's increasing. We had an increase of 10%.
If it's 1.4, it's 100%, right?
If it's 700,000 originally, it's 100% increase.
Yes, or the difference between original and final actual
But
is.
some of it is offset by $500,000, it's offset by revenue.
So are we, when we get reimbursed from CAL FIRE, or National Department of Forestry or whatever,
Mhm.
are we recording a receivable at that point? Due
If we don't
from-
receive the revenue, typically we budget just $775,000, I believe, in overtime every year. And then during our final augmentation, we look at what the fire season has done over the year and what revenues we've gotten from sending our guys to other districts to fight fires. And that is what we add to the overtime budget. The last couple of years, that hasn't quite been enough, so we've needed a little bit of contingency to cover the difference.
By a little, do you know how much?
I think it's about 100, maybe 200 grand. It's not too bad.
So that's overtime as a result of our going out to other areas, correct? Or is that overall overtime?
No, that's
Well,
over.
what we're adding in contingency isn't reimbursed from other areas. Most of it, like 500,000, 600,000, depends on the year, obviously how big the fire season is, but a majority is collections from sending our guys out.
So when you say 700, because just off the top of my head, 700,000 sounds like a lot for overtime, right?
It's the 400 or 500, is that?
Are you saying
It's
two?
really $1.4 million.
Yeah,
Are you saying
over the
that-
budget.
Are you saying, when you say there's 200,000 we don't get reimbursed for, are you saying it's actually 900,000? Or
No.
was?
Well,
no?
yeah. Yeah, because the original budget is just what it is. We're not getting reimbursed for that.
Okay, so we might be getting reimbursed for $500,000.
Right.
That takes it down from 1.4 to 900,000.
Right.
But the department itself is potentially running $900,000 in overtime a year.
Yes.
Yeah, that's, to me, that seems.
How does that, now that would be a metric in performance, comparing it to other, really fire departments, similar size and all, is that kind of unrealistic, or is it not? I mean, it's kind of hard to tell.
It sounds like a big number, but I don't know how many people,
Yeah.
and how many employees are in fire?
53 firefighters.
Okay.
Because if we hire any more firefighters, we have to give them more time off. We have to increase everybody's time off. It's in the bargaining
In their
unit,
collective
so,
bargaining.
yeah.
So then you have different.
So then you still have the
problems.
overtime. Yeah, it doesn't fix the situation.
It almost exasperates it.
When's the
Right.
next,
Worse.
when's the next time that's up for negotiation?
Off the top of my head, I'm not sure. I want to say
2023 or 2024?
Oh, is it 23? Oh.
So it's a pretty long time.
Oh, yeah, you just looked at it, you know.
Yeah. Yeah, it goes through 6, sorry, I've got it right here.
So is
I wanna see if
that
you could-
trend pretty much stable, like $700,000 every year?
We budget 775, I believe, every year. And then whatever wildland comes in, and then the last couple of years, there's been some that has to come from contingency, so.
So some reasons never adjusted.
Well, it's not adjusted because we don't really know what the wildland fires is. So I can adjust it up to 900,000, but if,
That is my point, that
Yeah.
we don't care that offsets, because if we're running a couple $100,000 each year, we're not even realistic.
well, and there's always a reason, like last year, he had a lot of trainees He had a lot of changes in staffing. So we're hoping that since he's got a more solid staff this year, that overtime number will go down.
So Dan, when you looked at the city fire time, the non-reimbursed, I guess is a better way to say it. So when you look at the non-reimbursed time, are you able to allocate and tell me how much of that was because of training, how much of that was from an actual incident, how much of that was because somebody called in sick? So is that something you have time to dive in and give me a little more analysis of the generation of that unreimbursed overtime so that we can dig deeper to say it's a one-off or it's an ongoing issue or you?
It's our understanding at this point, correct me if I'm wrong, that the categorization of those overtime hours in Telestat isn't being broken out at this point. That's a recommendation we have to utilize that subcategory function.
We don't know why?
To differentiate training versus mutual aid versus, that is not something we were able to test, because we had talked about that as in the last audit committee, to test the federal reimbursement
Right.
versus the city paid. And it's our understanding that we can't get that data.
So we wouldn't, what you're saying is, for the amount of money that we spend sending these firefighters out to California or so forth, the amount we get reimbursed, we can't tell whether we actually make money or lose money on that?
Oh no, we bill them, so we know how much we're billing them for our people.
But
So
do
we
you
should
know
be
that
able
it actually
to.
covers the overtime expense and so forth?
Well, yeah, because they know exactly who they're sending out at the time they're doing the bill, and they're creating the bill. I just don't know that now that it's year end, they can go back and tell which people, without pulling that report and figuring out again who they sent and what hours relate to.
Because
There
the
isn't
system
a
itself is
coded.
just coded as overtime, it's not
Right,
coded as
right,
reimbursable overtime.
right. And they can we can potentially look at maybe adding a code.
Yeah, I would like to see that.
Wow. So they only have one code, OT,
Yes.
in other words? So it's
Well,
not
they have a lot
OT
of
training?
codes.
or-
No, they have a lot of codes, but they don't really break out overtime, because they've got callback and training, they do have training code. They do have a bunch of codes, but they don't specifically split out the revenue-based overtime.
And is it, for financial statement purposes, is that reimbursement coded as revenue?
Yep.
Okay. So are you 100% confident that all of the stuff that we send out, when we send people out to work on fires, that we're at least breaking even on those?
I would never say 100% confident, because I'm not the one doing it.
But
It's the
from-
fire department that's sending out the bills, and
Oh, they generate the bill?
they generate the bills for the other districts, yeah. Because
Okay.
they know who they're sending, and I believe they send the guys and they get the full amount of the overtime for the person they're sending, plus I think they get some for the guy that has to fill in for them, is how it's been explained
Your
to me.
local thing, right?
Right,
And then,
that's how it's been explained to me.
Well,
That they
that's
not only get the.
That's not what was explained to me when I
Oh.
just did something, because
Well, maybe that's something Dan.
Like I said, we do have time in the budget. Fire overtime, we're running about half of what we have.
so you could test a couple.
So we certainly could go back.
To
over
say,
that
okay,
revenue
here's
side.
Johnny that was billed out on XYZ fire and
Mhm.
pull it, because one of the things the fire department comes every so often with the mutual aid agreements, and then we agree to how much is billed out on the vehicles, the staffing time. It has the rank, picturing the contract in my mind, but it says the rank of the person and how much per hour will be charged for so-and-so to attend it. So I don't think it's the way that I think it's the hour times the rate in the contract
Yeah.
that's
I
in
feel
there.
like
So
that
I don't
rate
think
in the
it's
contract,
Johnny and he costs me $100 and I bill it. I
Okay.
think it's Johnny was 10 hours and so therefore you owe me whatever the contract. So I think it's a good,
Yeah, we'll look at it.
test to go and pull the contract and test, if you have some time left, then to test a couple of the actual billings against the reality of the time of Johnny, right? To say, okay, hey, this when you broke even, or, ooh, we're losing money? Because one of the things in the overtime in the budget that we haven't done, because we keep doing it $775,000 a year, is we're not taking into account that the contract has increased their wage 3% per year, which means that's how much more overtime is generating for every hour. So even that baseline of 775 is not accurate because the wages have changed. But then on the other hand, if you grant them money in their budget, there's that other philosophy, they will go forth and spend. And so I see why you want to keep it at 775.
Performance-based budgeting comes into play.
Right.
Or
so-
but if it was more realistic, maybe there would be I mean, there's no incentive,
Right.
they're not sticking anywhere near it at this point. So maybe if there's a plan and an understanding of what that number should be, and then it can be, it's not that it's double every year, it's that why isn't it the number we originally assumed, and if it's based on these fires, then here's the reimbursement, that makes sense.
Mhm.
We had kind of asked around a little bit to some of the other fire departments, and typically there's a little bit more detail, but a lot of people are just trending that out historically and basing it off historical trends. I mean, I know that there are catastrophic fires and that number goes up, but some sort of additional analysis into what those numbers should be to get them a little closer. And even if it's just the fire department doing the hours, overtime hours, and then to your point, with pay raises and that, working with payroll or finance to determine the actual pay rate based on those hours.
Mhm.
Is it only the council that needs to be able to propose something that's make that?
Well, because otherwise we get to the end of the year and then there's well, guess what? Board of Supervisors, I need 300,000 to augment the fire budget. Wow, we don't have as much money as we think maybe to where obviously the best of all worlds is everything comes as close as it can be and you're only off 1%, that's the super, we're all super budgeters. I know that's Sherry and Nancy and I, right? We're super budgeters, but the reality is you also can't bury your head in the sand and just pretend it's not gonna happen, and then you get to year end in June and we're augmenting. But part of the thing that's different from a state level versus a local government level when it comes to augmenting also is they're using the functional area. So just because this guy runs out of money here, you still may not give it to him because he can functionally snatch from the public safety can share. It's kind of something odd, that everybody isn't really held, because if the fire department goes under, but the sheriff's department,
Yeah.
they're tied legally to the functional area, so.
Right, that's the same here, but I don't like to tell them that they can steal from another function, because the sheriff has his budget, and if he thinks he can steal from fire, and the fire has his budget, and he thinks he can steal from the
Right.
sheriff, then we're gonna have a budget violation.
Well, I know, well, you don't, then you augment it.
Because everybody thinks they can steal from everybody,
It's
so.
better augment it,
So,
but it's
yeah.
like looking sometimes, you'll look in the cabinet and say, well, how come the treasurer's office overspent their budget? Well, because they didn't augment it, because they didn't need to, because the clerk's office was under.
Right.
So it's hard for the public to understand, and I just think it's
So,
difficult in
questions,
general.
you jogged my information on this. Did you guys look at any of the billings?
For the reimbursement of those?
Yeah.
No.
Okay, so now I'm getting concerned, are the billings accurate?
Absolutely.
Right.
And then, when the billing, one question is the billing timely, right? And then once the invoice is sent out, is there a receivable recorded on the balance sheet?
No, because they usually get it within a year. They always get it within the year. I don't think I've ever had a year where there's been something he's waiting to receive. Because the fire season is usually July, August, September.
Right.
So we usually have the money before June. And in our current system, we only book receivables and accruals at year end.
But how do you know you're not missing one?
Yeah.
Well, we get.
You're not booking them as you go.
We get a sheet from fire. Fire tracks all their bills and all the money that comes in.
So you are booking them as you go, there's just nothing
So it's all-
outstanding, right? It's all sitting in revenue.
It's all
It's
side.
all
Yeah.
this is-
Yeah, it's an Excel spreadsheet tracking. They're tracking the bills, and then as the money comes in.
So
it
if you-
hits,
so
it
if
hits
you
our
run a-
GL.
So if you run a balance sheet at the end of November 30, there's not, the payments may not have come in and they're not on the balance sheet.
Nope,
But, so you're booking the revenue to the department, right? Like.
well, when the revenue comes in, it's booked. When the
Okay.
cash
Oh,
comes
so
in,
you're
it's
not booking
booked.
the revenue until
It's
the.
not, it comes in.
So you
Yeah,
just,
it's a
from a
non-looking
budget
basis.
standpoint, you just look like the fire department's
That's
way
cash
over
basis.
budget because
Yeah.
we paid these guys, right?
Right.
Right.
And so you
And
get
if
this
it looks
huge-
like that, I call Dave and I say, what is going on? And he says, oh, I got all these fire bills outstanding, they're coming. Okay.
Most of our revenues are on a cash basis throughout
Yeah.
the year,
Mhm.
and it may be with the new ERP, it will be different, but there's like utility billing and building permits. Some of them are actually, they book the receivable when they send out the bills.
Yeah.
But for the most part, all the other departments are on a cash
Yeah.
basis until June 30th, and that even includes the property taxes.
Mm-hmm.
And that might just be a function of our old systems, this is why we have to do it that way.
So how, with knowing that, then how thorough of a budget analysis can you do for the fire department?
That's a problem with the wildland fires. We don't know how many times you're gonna get called out.
Right, but I mean, just if you,
I
when
mean,
you
some
look
years
at.
it's 200,000, some years it's 600,000.
On a
That's why
monthly-
we don't even budget it.
Right, but on a monthly basis, if you're seeing these huge budget overruns because they've been called out, but you don't have the revenue recorded, you don't have the receivable on the balance sheet, you're looking at their budget and going, you guys are way over budget, what's going on?
Well, that's when I call fire and say, Dave, what's going on? And he says, oh, we have all these
But he can,
outstanding.
Here's a
like,
spreadsheet.
he
He's
can
got-
provide you the
he can-
numbers, so he's
Yeah,
got.
yeah, he sends me a spreadsheet and I go, oh, okay.
So
That's
what happens
enough or
when-
it's not enough. Right.
Yeah, so when it goes over budget, you just call and find out, and he
Yeah.
has the information to satisfy away.
Mhm.
The information is there, but it's just off system.
Yeah. Yep.
I had a question for Dan. You said there's that one exception, was it, out of the 20 that were looked at. Why was it that you thought that was an isolated case? What made you think of that?
Just because of the review of the rest of the documentation for all the other people we selected,
Okay.
Agreed to the support and was all approved in advance. The telestaff approval process actually occurs before the overtime is incurred, which isn't always the case. Sometimes it's a reactive system. But firefighters are applying, or the chiefs are going out and looking for people to fill those overtime positions in advance of the overtime being worked. So it's not like people are just showing up for work and getting paid and then someone's, signing off on it after the fact. It's all gotta be approved in the system before. So it was one mathematical error that slipped through the cracks versus, an overriding issue within
So it's not any individual trying to get some additional
Right.
overtime? Because I'd be concerned, then I'd say let's go a little deeper, take a look at more of that one individual.
That's a great segue. So we did, based on the information that we were provided, we were able to, trend the overtime by person.
Yeah.
And the majority of the dollars that we're talking about are earned by somewhere between 5 and 10 people in the system. And based on our analysis of their base pay versus overtime pay, and not knowing the intricacies of the vacation and doing that math, that's not something that played into our audit procedures. It does look like the city has the ability to fund multiple additional positions based on just the overtime that's being paid. When you're talking about $1.4 million in overtime, that's a lot of additional
Right, unless
firefighter
the collective
positions.
bargaining agreement prevents that, right?
Right. Well, I just
Well, it
don't
doesn't prevent
think it
just
would solve
triggers
the problem.
It just triggers another event.
Which is.
So if we go to the 54th firefighter,
Yeah.
instead of having 3 off per shift or something, they get 4.
Right, 'cause there's
So I got the new
minimum
guy, but another guy can be off, so I didn't get the new guy, is what you.
Okay.
And I'm not sure if anybody's done that analysis. We have not as part of our
Right.
engagement yet, but when you're talking about somebody earning significantly more than their base pay and overtime, I'm not sure how that math plays out.
And I think there are just a few individuals that like to go out to those out-of-town fires, so that's why it probably ends up being, you know, just 10 or maybe 5 or 10 individuals that are getting overtime, so.
Well, it goes back to it, I have to see the codes. I need to know what their overtime consisted of to determine whether adding a staffer would stop the overtime in the non-reimbursable versus they're earning 80% of that overtime by going out to a fire. Well, that's not gonna stop because that's a mutual aid or a call for. So even if I added the staffer, and so I'm a little disappointed we don't have the codes for the non-reimbursable to know why they're working. Because again, is it that I had an odd year out because we had 20 new, and I think I even remember the chief making a presentation that, wow, I had a really unusual year because we had so many vacancies. If- Yeah,
So salaries could go down and then
And then-
overtime's up, so you
Right.
kind of have to look at both of those.
but without, so I would say that's an area, whatever, for us to look at or to address, or again, make sure the new ERP system, we can't make good decisions here without data. I don't wanna just say they're doing well, or either one, I don't know.
And I could talk to the sheriff also, because I thought they were tracking that information, so maybe there's something that they're doing in Telestaff versus what the fire department's doing.
I think the modules are there, they're just not.
Oh, there's not using them.
Okay.
Do you know, Eric? Is that
No,
it?
so that's not part of the ERP system.
Oh.
This is
So
Telestaff.
this is
Telestaff needs
Telestaff
to-
that does this, but we have upgraded Telestaff. We are in the middle of that.
So maybe, I don't know, one consideration might be this reimbursable stuff, maybe we break it out as its own little department, right? So that you guys can know exactly where we stand with the reimbursable, the overtime incurred and the amount of billings we got outstanding, to make sure that we're at least breaking even on that stuff. And I don't get the warm fuzzies that
Yeah,
we even
well,
know.
I like the idea of having Dan take a peek at the
Mhm.
billings, because I've never seen them.
And I'm almost positive that we always come out ahead on the billings, because we also bill for, you know, rate for
Overhead
the
and
equipment and, you know, several other things,
Okay.
so,
Yeah, and there's overhead in there as well.
yeah.
But yeah, but it's not a bad idea, because Dan could also look at if those 10 people that are getting all that overtime, if they're on those wildland bills.
Right.
You know, if they're not, then what's going on? Why are
Right.
they getting so much overtime?
And if you, maybe if you make a separate code, it would be real easy to break
Yeah.
out.
I think I really like the idea of separate codes.
Yeah.
They're revenue neutral.
They're in the middle of testing.
Telestaff?
Yeah.
So that's what I'm, yeah. So, we need to find out, we're in the middle of the implementation of the new Telestaff system, which does all the codes. They're not changing the codes currently, so we need to know.
We need.
Yeah, so we'll need, and I
Why
don't know
are they
who.
using them, but not using them, and they exist?
Yeah, so
versus-
I'll have to find out, I guess, would you know, Sherry?
What? I'm sorry,
Different-
I was talking
So
to
the
Dan.
new Telestaff system is
Yeah.
being implemented right now, but they're not changing the codes right now. If they need additional information out of there, we would need to
Right.
change it right now, before I implement, which is really close. They're testing the last
We're in perfect timing.
Yeah.
we're actually behind, because they're already implemented and testing the current codes they have. If we're gonna
Okay.
add to it, we need to change it, but we need to know what the codes are, and would you know?
Right now, I don't, I mean, because I think we need to add an overtime out of area or mutual aid or some kind of.
Maybe we should get together and see if we can come
Yeah.
up and.
And you're saying once you have it set, you can't add codes?
No, we can add codes, but
Okay.
I'm just saying, right now is the time to do it.
Okay.
As they're implementing the new system, tell them,
Okay.
because we're working directly with
Yeah.
Telestaff on
Is
it.
there process documentation for this area somewhere? You know,
For the
For-
filling out timesheets?
yeah, like,
Yeah.
what do they use? That would tell you what codes they're using.
Oh,
and
yeah.
what's
Well, yeah, no, they have
Yeah.
what they're currently using, but it doesn't, they're not using what
They're
you're
not using
looking,
anything.
they're not well, they're using,
But it's available.
we don't know. That's the question.
Yeah.
So, because we're not gonna change for sheriff or fire from Telestaff, because that is the top product for doing the specific public safety. time.
Well, I would like the breakdown
It's gonna be-
of the reason for the overtime.
That's a top one, there's part of the reason.
I mean, none of
That's
it,
right. It's just not.
can't make any decisions if it's all just, oh,
So-
5,000 hours of OT, okay?
Yeah, there might be several codes that have.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
And that's what I
It
wanted
may
to
or
find,
may
that's why I
not
came back
exist.
over, need to find out
Training,
which,
you know, is it?
Right. Did I backfill because of training? Did I backfill because of sick leave? Did I backfill because somebody was on vacation? Did I backfill because somebody was hurt? They're out on workers' comp? Did I backfill? Anyway, so codes is a great discussion on this. And then if you have extra hours to dive in on
How
reimbursement.
time, how many hours do you have left that we
I'd
have?
have to do the math, we've got various levels involved, but we've got about $10,000 in E left. So, plenty, I guess.
Yeah. I'd say definitely looking at the building.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Perfect. So those are preliminary recommendations, and I talked about, so we have done various other analysis that I don't know that plays into our recommendations or findings, but we had the data and that was easy to do as far as trending over time, and I'm not sure if the group would like to see that. It doesn't necessarily need to be in like the questionnaire, we can get it out to the group, and if there's questions or additional information or to be able to see it and get back to us on. So the other internal audit project we worked on was the temporary staffing. And this one was a little different. We had just out of the gate trying to accumulate policies and procedures in order to test against, and we really found there aren't citywide policies over the use of temporary staffing. We were able to obtain the contract, obviously, and test against that and review that for some potential recommendations. But as far as a citywide policy, or even, once we did find a citywide policy, we went to the individual departments and asked, and they have loose policies on how that works and who gets approved to be a temporary staff person. And so that's kind of where lots of our procedures were based on the policies in place and testing against that. And when there weren't any, we moved on pretty quickly. We talked as a group last time about the FLSA and some of the other PERS stuff, and not an attorney. And so just wanted to throw this out there that there is some fine lines in FLSA for contract employers, independent contractors versus employees, and the contract with Telestaff seems to be very clear that they're independent contractors. But from the documentation that we looked at, and from some of the conversations we had, I think it's gray, and I'm not sure where the DOL would fall if there was an issue with the economic reality of what's going on, if these people are truly independent contractors, or if they're more acting as employees. Just a recommendation to throw out, because it's not really our area of expertise to figure that out. But there are, there's rules about people taking lunches and breaks, and documentation of some of these people where it looks like they're salaried employees, but they're being submitted to.
So just from a city perspective, have we ever done an FSL, Fair Labor Standards Act audit in the city? Exempt, non-exempt roles,
Not that
it's a
we're
lot of
aware
work,
of.
because you're having to look at what people actually do.
Yeah.
It gets,
With the pond.
Oh.
sorry.
That's
That's
right.
a few people in
Yeah,
conflicts.
yeah, so, I mean, HR goes through and we have job descriptions for every position, and they make sure, and it was probably, we went over it thoroughly when we did the pond effects study a few years back, and to determine, if people are in the right categories.
Exempt or non-exempt.
Yeah, and HR, is on an ongoing basis, always checking and looking at.
So I guess where I'm going is, do we know that carries over into the temporary positions? Because from what I understand, the temporary.
Temporary, yeah.
For
I mean,
marathon employees.
No, they just bill us and they're like any other
We just, they're like
vendor.
they're like a vendor.
So I assume
We let them-
they take responsibility for if they're in compliance with the Fair Labor Standards Act?
Yeah, we assume so.
Who do we use?
Four, there's
Primarily
four.
Marathon, primarily
Yeah.
Marathon, but there's 4 vendors we can use.
What's the total dollars again, Sherry, just ballpark?
I wanna say it's like 1.5 million.
That's budgeted, right?
That's the contract,
Okay.
so.
And that's managed in, by finance and by the overall
purchasing,
budget
right,
through
it goes for-
purchasing.
Yeah.
Um,
So we all watch over that.
At a high level, but as far as individual departments and how much they're tracking those and making sure that those employees are, you know, that, to go back to your side, performance measures of, you know, there's not really performance measures built into the Marathon contract, so just ensuring that that happens on a department by department level, that those employees, those temporary employees are performing for what you're paying for. Yeah. Because there is an additional burden with Marathon, right, that the employees get their rate and then Marathon gets their rate on top of that. So again, just
Real quick, did you guys look at like length of time, like who's the longest temporary we've had?
we didn't, because we kind of kept it to the fiscal years that we had discussed. We were looking at 17-18 data. But again, I mean, we could go back and look at that. We
I'm
did.
just curious, because you also get into employee temporary issues with the Department of Labor. If the person's been in a temporary role for, I think it's 12 months, if they've been in the temporary role for more than 12 months, there's some issues with the Department of Labor on, they're not really temporary. They're an employee. They should be getting employee benefits, you know, state pension.
But they're not city employees, they're employees of Marathon.
Right.
Right, but there's a cap on how long people can tap at a.
The freeze out periods, do you have freeze out periods?
I'm gonna say that's.
Yeah, because I think what you're talking, so we did find people who were employees, went on a contract basis and then came back as employees. Is that what you mean by freeze out? There's
No,
no
when you
downtime.
are a temporary worker and then, or it's say 18 months or so, whatever, and then you cannot work for that company for X number of months before you can come back.
There's a PERS, like if you're a retiree on PERS, then when you retire, you can't come back for, I don't
No,
remember,
this is
90
for-
days or something like that, yeah. So that's why some people will go on to Marathon and then.
To avoid that particular rule. It's a
Right.
workaround.
Mhm. So there is, just recommendations on timesheets being uniform across all departments. I mean, so they're Marathon employees, but city management's approving their timesheets, right? And so those are what get submitted to Marathon.
Marathon gave me the timesheet though when I did it. And then the employee filled it out and I approved it, and then I sent it back to Marathon.
Yeah.
So I'm just
So
approving
city
the time.
management are approving the time, you know,
Right.
to your point about, you know, where does the issue lie if there is an issue? And I don't know the answer to that question. It's just, we found timesheets, they're just not always being approved properly, definitely not documenting, you know, the FLSA stuff of lunches and breaks and, so whether that falls to Marathon, for the city, it's tough to tell, based on the contract. The contract seems to be very clear that it's their responsibility, but just, we did find that economic reality language.
Dr. Rader, just from a legal standpoint, I think somebody needs to get involved and make sure that there is a good separation there.
Right, yeah, I can certainly look into whether, you know,
They
what
should-
the city's obligations are in that regard.
Who supervises their work or says you've done a good job, or the city?
Well,
The
whoever
department.
hires
The
them, yeah.
department? And that might be an issue.
So like I had 2 pregnancies last year, so I was down 2 employees, and so we hired a Marathon person to fill in for one of them, and she only worked a couple days a week, but she, you know, she did a good job. I mean, she did what we asked her to, and so I signed on her timesheet. I mean, there's no evaluation process, or if you're not happy, you can call Marathon and say, hey, this person isn't working out, I need a new person.
And that's what we found in all the departments, that it was more of a check-in when necessary review of performance of the temporary staff.
But what on the timesheet gave you validation of work performed? So I turn in a timesheet, says I did 100 hours this month or whatever. So are you saying we really need a procedure that documents that the work was performed? What do we have?
No, the timesheet issue was more just approvals and sign-offs and making sure that was all consistent across departments. Just anytime you look at a bunch of timesheets, there's some that go unapproved or unsigned off on. Not tying that back to any additional documentation of work performed. I think that's up to the individual supervisors approving that, saying, yes, I got my 100 hours of work out of this person.
Question, is it all manual paper-based, or is it,
Yep.
the new ERP won't workflow it or anything?
I seriously doubt it. Because
No,
it's a
because
vendor.
this is separate.
Yeah, it's a
Submitted.
vendor, it's
Yeah.
it's
Their
their
timesheet.
paperwork, so.
Is the individual signing the timesheet, say I hereby certify type thing? Is there a validation? I don't know what the timesheet looks like.
The
Is it
timesheet
just-
they sent me had the employee signing off that, yes, these are my hours, and then I approved that, yes, she worked these hours for me. It didn't have any details to what she did, but it definitely was a, yes, I worked these hours, and she wrote in the hours, and then, I was approving that, yes, I worked these hours. And then
So
I
the
just scanned it in
procedure,
and sent it back.
Our internal procedure, well, maybe that's the problem, we don't have them really well, is that the person actually supervising that person's work is who's signing the timesheet?
Mhm. I think that makes sense, because
Yeah.
they're the ones
I'm asking,
knowing.
did we, has
Oh.
that been the practice? Or we didn't test for that practice?
I'm not sure
Or we're
that-
gonna
yeah.
fix it in the practice, whichever way.
Yeah, I'm not sure we had a list of all the people supervisors and tyed out their signatures. I don't think that was part of our procedure. Certainly could be, we still have all that data, just make sure the appropriate person approved timesheets. We were just making sure that they were approved.
And so you're saying you had a bunch that weren't even approved?
Not a bunch.
What are we talking about? You'll have to tell me what you're, we're not obviously reading it.
No,
There's one, I think.
absolutely. Was there one?
I think there was
Yeah.
one timesheet that we couldn't locate.
And more just from a document, I think our biggest concern is documentation of the, the FLSA stuff, making sure that if someone came back and looked at that, I mean, obviously, Marathon isn't questioning when they get a 40-hour straight work week timesheet that's signed off on it. That seems like that needs to be documented a little bit better.
I don't think, so none of our employee timesheets document when lunch is taken, breaks, or
Breaks,
anything.
okay.
So, yeah.
Would be
I mean,
consistent.
The entire city's like that, we just put 8 to 5.
Yeah. And if the employee's not getting those hours through Marathon, wouldn't they complain to Marathon? And then Marathon would let us know, hey, you're not following the laws, you have to follow the laws if you're gonna use our employees.
Who turns in the timesheet, the supervisor or the employee to Marathon?
The supervisor.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, just, this stuff is pretty high-risk stuff. We need to make sure we're in compliance, and I know hourly people, I mean, by law, they should be given 15-minute breaks every certain number of hours, and either 30 minutes for lunch, and the stuff has to be documented. We can't
So we
put
can
ourselves in a situation where, whatever department is, like, hey, I never get breaks. My boss doesn't let me take lunch. And then you end up in some class action lawsuit. And it's not anything we bargained for, but it can happen. So that type of stuff needs to be built into the payroll system so that people are, punching out for lunch, punching back in, and it's work for that employee. And I know it's a whole culture thing because I've dealt with it myself, but it's important stuff to do just from a legal standpoint. And then whether it's Marathon's responsibility or not, we as a city should be ensuring that we're using a reputable law-following vendor. We can't just say, oh, well, it's Marathon, they're Marathon employees, not our issue. That's kind of like, that fair trade stuff. When you're outsourcing stuff to other countries, you want to make sure that,
Yeah, we go through the state
Yeah, it's a state
contract.
jointer
A jointer.
contract, so the state.
I think when
All four
the
of our
revision
members.
is on your facility, you're still held responsible to make sure those rules are followed.
Yeah,
And just
and
as an
we're-
FYI, a long time ago, we had from our council a questionnaire that a supervisor could fill out, and it's a scoring system, and it shows the riskiness of whether it's considered an employee or a, a contract person. So you might have access to that questionnaire that may be good to circulate to see what the risk level is of being considered an employee or a contract person. And I had to do that in a prior job.
Yeah, the timesheets that come to you for approval, do they just do 8 to 5?
Mhm.
That's the entire city.
That's the
does
entire
that.
city.
Yeah.
We don't, I don't think
Don't?
anyone but maybe the pool, they have a time.
The only external
system
time clock is the pool for the lifeguards.
That the entire city, we don't clock out for breaks. That's not documented at all.
I mean, we can
The
see
new
if
system.
we can see if the new system would have something like that,
I would say
but.
from a risk management standpoint, I would suggest we look at it and see if we should be requiring clockouts for a minimum.
Well, I don't think there'll be a time clock for, that's really expensive to get time clocks for every single person in the city, but the ERP system might have some kind of where you can get in your computer and log in and log out.
Yeah. The new ERP system will have the ability to do time clocks if you want to. The issue is how stringent are you gonna be on it?
Right.
I started at 8.
I'm just suggesting that.
Okay, I clocked in at 7:57. Is that 3 minutes of overtime for me? Now we gotta write all the rules and everything behind this.
No, you
and-
turn around and you write them up for
Yeah,
class. I'm just telling you.
Well,
Yeah.
but then you're sitting there going, oh, wait, I'm waiting for a clock to come in. So this is, I mean, it does snowball. We do have the ability. I'm just worried where we're gonna go with that.
Yeah,
There's a
always-
cost benefit to everything.
Yeah.
Around that issue, there's always, like a buffer built around it, right? And managers have to manage it. If somebody's continually clocking in 10 minutes early and clocking out 10 minutes late.
Right. No, I
Then you got an
understand.
issue, the manager needs to address it, so it's.
Are we talking salaried people, or most people are salaried?
No.
No, most of
All the
them are.
unclassified, yeah,
Yeah.
Certain parts are salary, but yeah.
Maybe directors.
unclassified.
If it comes to
Well, I
temporary.
think we need to stick to
That's
talking
outside-
about the
that's-
temporary
I would say
staffing.
that's outside the temporary.
And
Yeah.
so,
Yeah.
I guess so I'm trying to figure out what you were able to test within this actual, and whether there's further testing we really want to send you on the mission of.
Definitely, yeah, so basically our testing consisted of reviewing those timesheets and tying them back to the information submitted to Marathon.
Like scope
We
one?
tested, so our sample was the actual invoices for Marathon, which could consist, we picked 20 invoices, but those could consist of multiple
different
people. So I think we ended up with about 70 employees, and then pulling the support.
70 temps.
70 temps, yeah. Great clarification. Absolutely. Strap us down already. So we ended up pulling 70 timesheets, does that sound right this time?
Yeah.
And tying them back as far as, was the right information submitted to Marathon? And our primary issues were in just the approval of timesheets. We did also compare temporary employees to permanent employees of the city based on information obtained from HR. We found some potential issues. We could look into these further if need be, but we found some potential double pay of employees, people who appeared on both lists as an employee, permanent employee and a temporary employee.
Who's the time period?
Uh-huh, yeah. And then there's also issues, not issues, but just with no policies and procedures, we found certain people who were paid, had left their position, became temporary employees, and some of them were paid more based on their temporary payment, and some of them paid less. It wasn't consistent, everyone always becomes a temporary employee and gets paid more, but there is a significant amount of people on that temporary employee roster, and then with the additional 21 to 23% marathon cut, just if there should be a additional analysis of whether those people should actually be employees. But again, it's tough with not a lot of policies and procedures or rules surrounding that.
So are you seeing
Based
it
on-
pervasive that employees leave the city as a PERS employee or whatever, and then turn around and come right back in on a marathon contract?
No, we found out of the 70 that we tested, we had, 8 issues that were questionable. Not questionable, that just met those guidelines, that criteria.
And of that.
That's more than 10%. I mean, that's 10% though. I don't know, I consider that pretty,
It's material.
that's material.
But that's across,
You're the 70 you checked.
and includes the people that, showed up on both lists, in the same pay period. It's not all one issue, it's the
Combination of
Yeah.
issues.
Okay, I mean, just to kind of summarize, I think for me, risk-wise, I think we got some issues with our contractors around making sure they're in compliance with Fair Labor Standards Act, exempt, non-exempt classifications, documented breaks, and then length of time they're as a temp for the city. Those are things that we might want to take a look at from a risk management standpoint.
And certainly that last one we've
The
got.
length of time is probably the most important. That one's gonna be the one that will hit our
Yeah, and
responsibility.
This
the
exempt,
highest.
this exempt, non-exempt thing can be huge if we've got, non-exempt employees doing exempt level work and not getting compensated for it because of the way that Marathon, or
Classified.
because of what work Marathon thinks they're doing and what they're actually doing, right?
That's a contract compliance thing? 'Cause there should be a scope of work.
Yeah.
Yeah, we have a large range of temp employees. I mean, we've got everything from engineers at Public Works when they just need an engineer for one project, so they hire a specialist
Yeah.
through Marathon, down to like office staff that we just need a secretary for a few days. So it's a very wide range of what these people do.
And couldn't you just update, just a question on a best practice, wouldn't you just update the spreadsheet? So like one of the things on the timesheet I used to sign that didn't detail out when I took a break and all that, but when I signed my timesheet, I also signed my certification right then and there that my appropriate time periods and breaks were adhered to. Because it then locks out the employee for being able to go back to sue, because you only have a certain amount of time to say, oh no, that was an error, and I really didn't get it. So again, in a best practice, should we update the timesheet to say, I
Didn't you say
hereby
that's on there?
certify?
We
I
can
worked
update
that.
our timesheets.
Hmm?
We can update our timesheets, but the timesheet I signed for Marathon, that was their document. I
No, but I'm
can't update
saying
their
is
document.
that's a contractual thing we could work on
We
even
could put
with
it in the
them.
contract.
To update, to have the employee sign off a certification that they have complied with the law.
Required breaks.
And that, yes,
Yeah.
so that again, the city has that layer of protection that, hey, Marathon, it's on the Marathon contract, it's on the thing, and so they're certifying, because that's what I used to do. I hereby certify that I complied. Because part of the problem is gonna be the person's out in the field, so it's not gonna be Marathon or the city not telling the guy that's working at the park that he can't go take his 30-minute break. We're not gonna have a custody control like you do inside of an office. Sherry knows that everybody left at noon and went to lunch and came back at 1 o'clock because they're all in the same office. So just a question again on a best practice, should we update that contract to require a certification on the timesheet to add the layers? So I'm more interested, the one that I think that can get the city potentially is it an employee relationship, is the length of time they've been on the Marathon contract, and it becomes, it's not temporary,
Yeah, they've been.
it's not temporary
Yeah,
work,
they've been here
it's
for 3 years or something like that.
5 years, 10 years, whatever.
And do we have the ability, does that sound like something we'd have the ability to get our hands on? Because that was talked about originally, I think it was in our audit program.
We could ask Marathon if they could dig how long
There
they
you
worked
go.
with us.
The contractor should know.
Yeah.
There we go.
I think at first pass, there wasn't an easy, it wasn't information the city had at hand to
Yeah.
obtain, so.
So maybe that's something we have to do.
Ask
the
them
scope, add
for
that
a
to the
scope on the length of
For those
service.
70 people, maybe we can see if Marathon can provide a start and end date.
Or do you just want can they tell us the,
Current ones and how long
longest.
they've been working on the city contract.
I
I
don't
mean,
know
there's-
I don't know what they can provide. We'll have to find
Ask.
out what they can provide. Because if they can provide a big report that shows everybody right now, great, but if
And
they
how long?
can't, then maybe we can pull a sample.
So, and Dan, these policies, you're saying there's lack of policies, is there no policy? Or there's policies, but they're all different departments have different policies, or?
Yeah.
there's no formal policy.
Okay.
Departments have their own procedures, I guess.
So that's,
No citywide.
It's gotta
that's a recommendation, that's
It's gotta
easy.
come from
Yeah.
HR
Okay.
and Linda, as far as what we're gonna.
I'll
Yeah.
double check and see what I can find on policies and procedures and that sort of stuff. I haven't looked into that, but I'd be surprised a little bit if there's not something.
I'm pretty sure there's not. We've been talking about it for years, and every time we look into it, every department's doing things so differently that it's really hard to develop one policy, because we need them for so many different things. I mean, Public Works is mainly hiring them for, projects and jobs, and seasonal for parks, and then Health has them for their grants. And so when the grant runs out, then the temp leaves, and there's just so many different reasons that we hire these temporary people that putting it all in one policy it was thought to be too challenging, so we let the departments
So a couple of the areas
develop
for
their procedures.
of concern really comes from, one, do we validate that before the person comes on, they're not on a do not hire list? Because there's no checking. So I go to Marathon, jump on their contract and I go out, or the city person knows somebody and they go jump on, but that there's no validation that they're not on a do not hire. Or let's say they worked for us and we had to release them and say, that employee's just not working out, but they get onto a do not rehire list. And so that I didn't see that there was any checkpoints with human resources. And maybe I can be a little more direct in what I'm looking for too, is did they have, or do we want to implement, so you can't come back to work PERS-wise for the entity unless you have a 90-day break. Well, do we want to implement that? You're also not going to go to work in any of the temporary contracts for at least 90 days. Do we want to adhere to the spirit of the law, or are we looking for the loophole and saying, go ahead, resign, retire, and come back tomorrow as the contractor?
And maybe, there's probably other cities that have dealt with these issues.
I remember, even when we were, I think it was the PEBS law changed and people had to retire before a certain date in order to get that benefit. But then governments were left with just a huge brain drain of all these people leaving. And so there was a huge push to bring those people back on contract just to keep the
To not
government
lose all
moving.
that
Yeah.
knowledge.
So there is that side of it too, just to be aware of it. There can be a potential that someone leaves for a reason, but then the city really needs that person, so.
Or probably a level of approvals that have to happen before they can do that, right?
Policies and procedures.
Well, and again, what we had, remember what we did, we declared that position was so critical, I'm gonna let the guy come back.
Mhm.
But that it had to rise up to say, there's such a shortfall, that's what they had, that there isn't anyone else, if I don't bring Johnny back, we're gonna lose the sewer plant. I have to.
Right.
Versus, no, there's a whole bunch of people that you can hire to do X, Y, or Z. Or they were put on very short, again, but you have management saying, okay, we're gonna bring him back, but it's only for 90 days, so he can cross-train the guy we hired to do the replacement. So anyway, procedures is what it's all about.
And maybe we can try to do higher level policies and leave the procedure to the department. So more of a high level policy of you
These are
have
the
to.
minimums you have to have. in your
Yeah, these are,
procedures.
if you're gonna hire somebody back, you have to talk to HR. If you know, kind of the higher level oversight.
Mhm. It's certainly an area we have some work to do.
Yeah. And we knew this, I mean, I knew this going
You've
into it,
got all
so.
kinds of issues. Does the person know the person they're bringing in? Is there nepotism? I mean,
I think that's big.
Well, but a lot of times if you know the person, you work with the person, you know they're good.
As long as you're not related, that's okay.
Yeah, I know. That's how I feel. I don't, and nepotism I do not agree with, but.
That was not for where, we didn't do the nepotism, last name check.
Mhm. Okay.
okay.
So we've got some additional direction, and then, what's that?
We worked hard.
We
I
had
think this is
3
the last
items.
audit, longest audit meeting we've
God, I
had.
only had 3 items.
They're important.
Yes, they are.
Yeah. So as far as coming back, to the audit committee at the next, I mean, we can certainly provide the details along the way and come back with final reports on all these areas.
We're expecting to have those two in final form.
Or I guess I'm just looking for direction. It's,
You gotta go back in like a flyer.
oh,
Both
absolutely.
of them that we're looking for a little more drilling.
Because it is the next meeting on the.
No, it's
Not
kind of
yet.
like we're looking at probably, I think usually we're kind of looking to say, when do you think you'll get a good point?
We
or
want the
something to
final,
us?
when will you have a
Yeah.
product for us?
Yes, and final product being the full report with the findings and recommendations based on,
Mhm.
do I have to give you that answer right now?
No.
Okay. Let me check with my staff and make sure.
It would help us set the next meeting, right? I mean,
Yeah, you know, I think typically we've done in the past is we want to get at least every quarter, every 3 months.
Yeah.
So we don't want to go too far beyond that. But so, you know, if there's a lot happening, maybe do
And
it a
we
little
can
sooner.
cancel
but-
it if
Yeah.
you're not able to.
No, yeah, if it's in the next quarter, we can certainly make that happen.
Yeah, or have something, you know, or it's a matter of you wait a few more weeks, and we really have something, so that's just a, you know.
April.
April timeframe?
Or even May, April, May.
Yeah, late April or May.
Careful, you.
April 15th.
April 15th, after April 15th, that sounds
Let's do
right.
April 1st.
In the afternoon.
April Fool's Day.
Oh, I knew what that was coming up. I could do the 14th of May, oh, May or April, where are you at?
I'm on April 23rd, basically 3 months from today.
I'd say take it in May, I'm on May 7th.
Yeah, I'd probably be good with it.
May 7th?
You do May 7th? Again? How'd that work out? We can all do May 7th. I'll hit
And what time?
Got a little late.
Yeah.
2.
2 normally, well, we can be done.
We used to have them at 1,
Yeah.
so we can do it at 1 in the afternoon or 2.
I thought, no, 3 is okay, because I thought we usually go for 2 hours,
Right.
5.
I thought we pushed them later to help with people's work.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, we were for a little bit there. We had one person that wanted it
We also got bumped up because we didn't have access to
to the room.
I'm fine.
Push
with-
us back in there.
I'm fine with 3.
3?
Yeah, typically it takes 2 hours, but everybody else is
Okay.
fine with 3.
May 7th, 3 o'clock.
Okay.
Got it. Okay.
That's tentatively the date.
So we have
But
no,
if we set it for
no,
sure, it's probably.
Sorry, that's 6B, public comment, no public.
Just have to call it out anyway. Any
Okay.
kind of public comment, be legal.
Okay, the public is invited at this time to comment on any matter that is not specifically included on the agenda as an action item. No action may be taken on the matter raised under this item of the agenda. Hearing none,
May
thank you.
7th at 3 o'clock.
Meeting is adjourned.
Good.
Thanks
Does
for
that
everybody's
work?
time.
Does that work?